What is up guys, Blue Spooky here. Just wanted to let you guys know before this video starts that this is going to be a compilation of some of the stories from this entire year so far. Some of the best ones I could pick out. My throat is not feeling too well tonight, so I'm gonna have to do this because I can't really record right now. But hopefully tomorrow will be just fine and I can get back to recording as usual. The only ads will be at the very beginning of this video, so if you want to listen to this in the background while you do something else, it'll be an extra long video for you to enjoy. So thank you very much for understanding, and I hope you guys enjoy the video. This happened about a decade ago, and it still scares me. My great aunt lived alone in a small 2-floor cape house one town over. My grandfather had built it for her in the 1940s. She had a tiny spare bedroom and a writing office upstairs. My great aunt was a nun and a teacher, and would often write friends, former students, and work on a book of her stories that she never quite managed to finish up there. My mother and I would visit from time to help take care of the chores in and around the house, as the years continued to go on. When I left for college, my mother started visiting more often. No sense in both of them being left alone, she told me. Whilst I was away, unfortunately, my great aunt started showing signs of dementia that progressed quite steadily. It started with stories she'd tell us for the 1000th time, even though we already knew them well. One would start when she and my grandfather were kids, then somehow resolve with her as an adult. Basically, she'd combine unrelated stories into one, leaving her extremely confused afterwards. She also started forgetting to eat, take her meds, and would crank up the heat in the summer to the point she'd be extremely dehydrated. Some days were worse than others, so when I finished college, we started visiting nearly daily. She absolutely refused going to an assisted living home. We set up meals on wheels and asked some of her friends and former neighbors to come by, so we wouldn't be the only ones taking care of her. My mother and I also convinced her to start writing in the kitchen rather than upstairs instead, to prevent her from having an accident on the stairs. Without a reason to go upstairs any longer, we shut off the old second-floor heaters and closed the over-painted squeaky door to the stairs. We'd find the door cracked open every so often, but my aunt insisted she didn't go up there anymore. We weren't the only ones stopping by though, so maybe someone had fetched something upstairs and forgotten to close it. Again, my great aunt was a nun, so around the holidays she'd roll out the more religious stories and talk about God quite a lot. One day, when I happened to be visiting her alone, she started reflecting on her life, mortality, and when the man upstairs was going to come for her. I changed the subject as it was quite uncomfortable, but over time she started talking more about when she'd die. He's going to come for me soon. I don't know when the man upstairs will do it though. I tried to reassure her. Auntie, I'm sure you have many years left. God isn't going to come take you anytime soon. With the most serious expression I'd ever seen on her sweet old face, she said, "No, not God. The man upstairs." Around this point in time, she started seeing things. Flashes or spiders that weren't there. Even a little boy in her living room that only she could see, even when my mom and I were visiting. Initially, I chalked this statement up to dementia. Later that week, snow fell, so after shoveling myself out early, I went to my great aunt's to shovel her walkway for my mom, who'd be visiting later. After shoveling a bit, I called her from my warm car so she'd know it was taken care of. I also said I wasn't coming in, as I had to go to work. She thanked me, and I drove off. I noticed I'd forgotten my rock salt I had used on the walkway though, so I decided to circle the block and pick it up real quick. As I was reaching over for it, I caught something out of the corner of my eye. The second-floor light in the old writing office had just turned on. I glanced over quickly, then pretended I hadn't seen it. I ran to my car and went down the road a short ways, confirming in my mirrors that it was still on, and I called my mom. "Hey Mom, can you call Auntie and see if she has anyone over?" Don't say I asked, by the way. Let me know how long it takes her to pick up." My mom called back almost immediately. "No, she doesn't have company over. Not this early. She picked up right away. Why?" "You need to call the police right now. The light upstairs turned on after I talked to her. There's no way a 95-year-old lady hung up, hustled upstairs, and went back down to pick up your call right away." As my mom called the police, I called my aunt once again. "Hey, Auntie, I almost forgot. You have a doctor's appointment today. I'll come pick you up, okay? We can grab a hot chocolate before we head on over." I parked my car in front of the house and acted as normally as I could. It felt like an eternity, helping her get her house coat on and out the door. As I turned the lock, I heard footsteps above us on the second floor room, where I'd seen the light turn on. I helped her into my car quickly, not once looking back at the house, too scared for what I'd see in the window. We shot down the road a bit, and I called my mom again. She was already on her way over, and said the police would be by shortly as well. I told her where I parked, and I waited. She arrived, and the police weren't far behind her. I flagged down the cop when he got closer, and told him what I'd seen and heard. He radioed for 2 more cars. My mom stayed with our great aunt to keep her calm, as the police now surrounded her house. I handed them the keys to the doors. 2 went in, as the 3rd cop and I stayed outside. A few tense moments passed, and the 2 officers returned with a disheveled, gaunt man, wrapped up in handcuffs. "Oh, that's the man upstairs," my aunt said to my mother, onlooking as they fought with this crazed man to get him into the back of one of the cruisers. Apparently, she had accidentally let a disturbed homeless man in, thinking he was the Meals on Wheels guy. He had been secretly living upstairs this entire time. My great aunt hadn't even known if he was real or not. When we were allowed back in, we saw that the upstairs was a complete mess. Garbage, rotting food stolen from the kitchen, and the amount of filth was scary. The creepiest things, though, were the notes. Written many, maybe hundreds of times in different inks and pencil scrawlings around the writing office window that overlooked her walkway, was, "Go away. Don't stay. I'll come down." The back of the door to the stairs had notes too. "She can see me, but you can't. I can see you." It was clear he had probably written notes each time someone visited over the weeks and possibly months he had been staying there. My great aunt was temporarily shocked, but it was quickly forgotten given her condition. She would ask about the man upstairs less and less. The homeless man, who was in poor physical and mental health himself, was hospitalized and unfortunately passed after a few weeks later into the winter. Apparently he had escaped and died in the snow. Very unfortunate circumstances. My mom and I told my auntie a couple of weeks later when we found out. "Oh, I know. He told me last night. He's upstairs again, but you guys can't see him now." At that instant, my mom and I heard the door to the stairs squeak open, and we decided never to go up there again. So this happened to me about 4 years ago. At the time, I was 20 years old. It was during a tattoo convention in Toronto. I was still an apprentice artist back then, and this was my first time working at a convention. I was super excited, but also a bit underprepared. There were 6 of us going from the studio I worked in, 3 guys and us 3 girls. We booked separate hotel rooms. The guys booked theirs early, which was smart, whereas I booked the room for the girls very last minute. I didn't realize then that the rooms would all be booked up near the convention center. Needless to say, there were almost no affordable rooms left. I had a mini panic attack before I finally found a shitty Super 8 in Chinatown with a room left. I asked if any of the other gals minded. They were totally fine with it, as we wouldn't be staying at the hotel much anyways. Fast forward to us arriving there. It was literally inside an Asian strip mall. It was extremely sketchy, but hey, what could we do now? We checked in, unpacked, and headed down to the convention center to set up our supplies. Afterwards, a bunch of other tattooers asked us all out for drinks. All 6 of us said sure, and we met up at a bar together. We had a pretty great night actually, and everyone was having a full-on blast. I was really not used to drinking at all though, and it was getting later and later. Being my first convention, I didn't want to be tired and hungover the next day, so I asked if anyone wanted to leave with me. They were all still partying though and didn't want to go. I didn't want to ruin their fun time, so I let them know I'd be heading back myself. I called up an Uber. When I got back, it was completely empty. I walked through the entire mall complex, and it was silent and dark. I made it to the hotel entrance and walked past the check-in desk. Dark there. It seemed no one was around anywhere. I was starting to get a bit creeped out and was kind of looking around nervously. I took the elevator to my floor and walked past the communal breakfast area. This is where scary shit started to happen. The breakfast room was pitch black, but I could see the silhouette of a man just sitting in there alone. When the man saw me, he stood up, and I could hear his footsteps creeping up behind me. I tried to stay calm. I told myself he was probably just heading to his own room. You're freaking out for no reason just because it's late. As I continued down those dark halls trying to find my room though, I decided for whatever reason to turn around. That led to the most disgusting sight I've ever seen. The doors for each room dipped into the wall slightly, you see. As I turned around, I shit you not, the man behind me dipped into one of the doorways out of sight, then peered at me from behind the wall. We made direct eye contact, and my heart fell into my stomach. I turned back around and started walking faster to get back to my room and lock the door. I was almost there now. I was at the T intersection of the hallway. There was a fire extinguisher behind glass in front of me. I could see the man following behind me in the reflection. I turned around again, only to see him dip behind some furniture and peek at me from behind it. At that point, I absolutely lost it. I started running and booked it the last few meters to my room around the corner. I swiped my keycard so fast, I'm surprised I didn't fumble and drop it. I slammed the door shut behind me and locked it up tight. Thank God I turned a corner, because it seemed he hadn't seen which room was actually mine. I looked through the peephole in the door and watched him pace around the hall for a good 10 minutes before walking away. I immediately went to the hotel room phone to try and call security, but no one was answering. I called my coworkers, who were still at the bar, and told them what had happened too. They came right away and helped me find an employee. I guess they had next to no staff overnight, and no security whatsoever. The employee we did find tried to look for the guy, but of course he was long gone by now. He told me he'd checked the cameras, but I never heard if anything came from that. I don't know what would have happened if that guy had caught me, and I'm sure glad that I didn't have to find out. Every year, I like to take my family on vacation, so we can all have an enjoyable week of relaxation and bonding time together. We usually stay in hotels, but after having a third kid with my wife, we decided it would be best to stay in a house. Our 7-month-old son would often cry and throw tantrums most nights, and I figured that would be very inconvenient for the other guests. I'd never stayed in an Airbnb before, but I decided I would give it a shot, since my coworkers all spoke very highly of it. After getting used to navigating the site, I started to narrow down my search within a couple of cities that my wife and I thought would be nice to visit. I was excited when I found this beautiful house that went for a decently low nightly rate. It was just a short walk away from the ocean as well. In addition, there were shopping plazas where we'd be able to get our groceries for the week just a short drive away. I looked over the host's rating on the website, a middle-aged man named Tom. I was very happy to see he was consistently given a 5-star rating. I booked the house for 7 days, officially planning out our trip. After a super long car ride there, we finally pulled up to the home around 10:30 on the Friday we scheduled to check in. The house was pitch black and surrounded on all sides by woods, gave off a real eerie vibe. We followed the emailed instructions given to us from Tom to get into the home. We typed in the garage code and walked to the safe in the corner of the garage to enter the code to get the key. We got inside without too much trouble and began to unpack our things. The house was huge, having 6 bedrooms and 4 bathrooms. Quite an upgrade to our own humble abode. My wife and I noticed the air smelled a bit musty inside, but we assumed that nobody else stayed here the week prior or something. We all brought our luggage up the stairs and picked out our rooms. Our 2 sons stayed in the same bedroom at the end of the hall, while my wife and I took the master bedroom, putting our baby in the room directly next to us. We were all quite exhausted from all this traveling, and probably went to bed around 11:30 or so. At some point during the night, though, I was awakened to hear my son talking to his mom next to our bed, saying that he'd heard a bunch of scary noises. My wife calmed him down and tucked him back in. This wasn't something uncommon. Our sons were both 5 years old and would often get spooked at night. I dozed off again pretty quickly. I was awoken once more by the sound of both of our sons running to our room crying this time. They both insisted they'd heard footsteps coming from above them. I decided I'd flip on the lights to get up and walk around with them to show them they were safe and nothing was there. After doing this, they relaxed a bit and I laid back down to go to bed. After I closed their door, though, I checked around once more, feeling a bit concerned now. I opened the door by their rooms that led to the attic and walked up the steps. I saw that the door at the top of the stairs was locked, which didn't surprise me. Within minutes of crawling back into bed, though, I heard screaming coming from my son's room. I sprinted out of bed and down the hallway and threw open the door to their room. I flipped on the lights. I could see both of my sons laying on their beds hiding under their covers. I walked over to them and asked what was wrong. Their response was very unsettling to hear. One son told me he'd heard their door creak open and seen a shadow of someone staring in at him right outside. Something about the tone in his voice and the terrified look in his eyes told me he was not just making this up. Normally, I would just think this was one of their night terrors since we were staying in a foreign place. But with this being the 3rd time now, I couldn't help but believe what they were saying. By now, my wife was standing in the room with us. She'd heard everything. I asked her to take everyone into our room and stay there. I did have a concealed carry license and usually carried my gun with me, but this time I'd left it back at home not thinking I'd need it. Now I regretted not having it with me. I knew I'd have to search the house with nothing. As I crept downstairs to the main floor in the dark, I felt a bit scared. It was pitch black and completely silent. The sound of my breath and the light footsteps on the ground were the only sounds I could hear. They felt quite loud, despite my efforts to stay silent. I knew the light switch was somewhere at the bottom of the stairs. I fumbled around in the dark for a minute until I finally found it and flipped it on. My jaw dropped as I looked around and noticed that the front door to the house was wide open. I knew I had made sure the doors were all closed and locked before we went to bed. I slammed it shut, locked it again, and ran upstairs to inform my wife and kids as I locked the master bedroom door behind me. She dialed 911. They said they would have officers there soon. We were instructed to stay inside the room no matter what. Even though it was now 2:30 in the morning, I called the Airbnb owner to let him know there was some sort of break-in. I dialed his number and put it on speaker so my wife could hear him too if he picked up. What we heard next still haunts me to this day. All of a sudden, I could hear a faint ringing coming out from above us in the attic. It sounded immediately as I called him. My wife and I both looked at each other in total shock, knowing the house owner's phone was in the attic. The police arrived minutes after, and we explained everything that had happened. We booked a hotel that night, which was a short drive away from the Airbnb, and enjoyed the rest of our vacation. We eventually followed up with the police, wondering if they'd attained any further information. Turns out, Tom, the owner of the Airbnb, was in the attic that night walking around, which explains why our sons had heard those noises. He'd snuck down and opened the door to our son's room, but hid as my wife and I had gotten up after hearing our sons screaming. As we passed one of the rooms on the way down the hall, he crept down the stairs and ran away. Finally, we learned that the attic had several monitors hooked up to secret cameras around the house, so he was able to see and hear everything. It was quite a horrifying experience as a first-time Airbnb guest, and I plan to only rent hotels from now on. The following is a true story that happened in the early 1990s when I was about 14 and lived with my parents. When I was 13 years old, my dad worked for a government contractor, and his work moved us from our hometown to another location about 200 miles away. To me, it seemed out in the middle of nowhere. We moved over my 9th grade year, but my dad moved first to find a place for us to live while our old house sold. We ended up staying in a rental for a short period of time, so my parents could find the right house to stay. After a few months went by, my parents finally found a place. Where we lived before, my hometown was a suburb and super expensive at the time. Where we moved to, the land and homes were a lot cheaper, so my parents took good advantage of that and bought a huge home. We went from a single-story, 3-bedroom, 1-bath house to a 5-bedroom, 3-bath, 2-story home. I didn't get to see the house before my parents put the offer, as they went home shopping while I was still at my new school. I remember when they drove by for the first time to show us the new house. It looked like a mansion compared to our other one. Although I did miss all my friends and my old neighborhood, this house looked so cool. It was in the oldest part of the city, as there was a lot of new construction going up all around. My parents had apparently got a really good deal on this home. Once we went inside, I knew why. It was evening when my parents got the keys to the new house, so by the time we met the realtor and drove over, it was dark outside, which made it all the more creepy. When we walked in, it was like a time capsule, like everything was frozen in the 1960s. It also had this musty old smell, like the place had been vacant and non-touched for years. Much later, I found out that, in fact, it had been sitting vacant for 8 years before we'd bought it. Even before that, it was odd the previous owners had never updated anything about the house. There was shag carpet everywhere, the appliances were all from the 60s, and the paint in the rooms was weird colors and peeling off. It looked like a crash pad for hippies or something. My dad was very handy, thankfully, so immediately they got to work renovating everything. My dad called in a lot of family help. Eventually, it was completely renovated, and we moved in. I had always felt uneasy in certain parts of the house. I could never explain it, but things like shadows appearing, lights turning on and off, even my sister's hairdryer turning on at 2 a.m. by itself one time. The thing that happened the most, though, was footsteps. I would hear them coming downstairs at night when everything was quiet. Fast forward to a year after we'd moved in. I was the first to notice something odd in the house. This started when I asked my parents to move to an upstairs room because it was bigger and had a walk-in closet. They agreed, of course. I started thinking about the layout of the house upstairs. You see, there was this big open room that was a majority of the upstairs space. We used it as a living room. At the end of the hallway that went to 2 bedrooms and 1 bathroom, the layout didn't make much sense. There was a void behind the other bathroom that was adjacent to mine. In fact, it was big enough room for another bedroom entirely, but that space went out over the garage. One day, I drew out our house like a diagram. I couldn't figure out why there would be such a big void there with nothing in it. I asked my dad, and he kinda shrugged it off. One day, I went outside to that side of the house to scope a bit further, and noticed something odd. It appeared there had once been a window there or something. It was covered up by some big vent-looking thing and a sloppy patch of stucco. At this point, I was super curious. I studied the layout once more and noticed the wall on the other side of the bathroom had a patch of drywall in the shape of a doorway. I must be right. There was another room here, but why had it been sealed off? Obviously, my dad would have killed me if I just broke open the drywall, so I had an idea. I wasn't sure if it would work. One day when my parents were away visiting my aunt and uncle, I opted to stay home. I knew they would be gone for hours because of the distance. I figured out that if I went up to the attic crawl space above the garage and broke through the drywall there, my dad might not notice that I'd done so. I doubted he'd ever go up there on his own. I grabbed some tools with me and began to cut through the drywall. Eventually, I made an opening big enough to crawl through between the studs. I was right. There was another room of our house hidden here. I was half excited and half terrified. I was excited I was right, but after looking around the room, it was obvious it had been a bedroom at one point in time. The walls were an old pink color, and the carpet had been completely pulled up. There was no padding, just the strips that tacked the carpet to the ground. I could see where they'd closed off the doorway. There were no doors to the closet in that room either. It looked like at one time there had been something on the wall, but it had been ripped off. The only other thing I found in there were cigarette butts and old beer cans. Must have been either early 70s or 80s. Like I'd seen from the outside, there was also a place where a window had been removed. Some metal vent was nailed into place to cover the opening. I only had a cheap flashlight with me, and even though it was during the day, the room was pitch black inside. I started to get a real creepy feeling being inside here. The smell was very off. I got out of there and tried to make an excuse for going up to the crawl space. I started moving boxes of old junk up there, so I could tell my parents I was cleaning the garage and had found it. When my parents got home, I made up some story I was putting boxes away and noticed a hole. They didn't get mad or anything. They eventually came clean that the realtor told them about the room. I was like, hey, let's open it up and make this a 6th bedroom in the house. My dad refused, said to just leave it alone. Eventually, some time passed. On occasion, I would take friends up there to see this mystery room. After I opened it up, though, things in the house started to get even creepier. Footsteps going all the time. The ones walking up and down the stairs would be louder. There was more shadows appearing in the shape of people. One time, a family friend screamed because she said she saw a woman in the mirror as she was walking up the stairs. She thought it was my mom, but when she turned, it disappeared. Another time, a friend who was sleeping over in the other room sprinted outside in the middle of the night so scared that he'd gone out in his boxers. Said someone had been standing over him while he was sleeping. When I was about 16, I happened to talk to an older neighbor, and he mentioned that he was one of the original owners in that neighborhood. I asked him about my house. He mentioned something about the son who used to live there going to prison back in the early 70s. Wouldn't go into details, but said it was really sad, and not to let drugs ruin your life. I looked up some old newspapers and stuff in the library, only to find an old article about a teen who'd killed his mother and attempted to kill his father before he was arrested. My family moved out shortly after I turned 17, and I never went back to that house again. I used to go to this bar that was a bit on the seedy side, I guess I'd say. It was one of those bars that was just sort of set in against the side wall of a building. It had a very small inside, a jukebox, and a ton of neon signs. There were also, of course, a bunch of regulars who came in there every night. Very seldom did anyone new come in, actually. I was one of the very few women who did, though I only came in about once a week on Fridays after work just to relax a bit. Around Christmas time one year, a new guy came into the bar. He was attractive enough, and there was some interest right away. I had a boyfriend, though, who I was very happy with. After looking at me across the bar for more than half the night, he finally approached me and offered to buy me a drink. I declined and let him know I was already in a relationship, and I didn't really want to sleep around. He insisted he didn't want to sleep with me. He only wanted my heart. Every week when I made my way over to the bar after work on Friday, he would be there on the spot. I learned that his name was Charlie, and he seemed to be new in town as well. He came up to talk with me each time I was there. He would always ask me if I had broken up with my boyfriend yet, and when I told him we were still together, he would ask why my boyfriend wasn't there with me. I let him know that my boyfriend worked later than I did, and I always came here because I knew the bartender anyway. I don't think he really believed me though. He would just keep on talking to me. It wasn't too irritating at first. I supposed it was kind of flattering he was interested in me, but each and every time I came in for my drink on Friday, he would ask me right away if I'd broken up with my boyfriend yet. and he would always emphasize that part too. Yet, it began getting very uncomfortable on Valentine's Day that year. My boyfriend happened to have the day off work, so he decided to go with me to the bar this time. It was actually really nice. The two of us were just having a relaxing drink together. When Charlie came into the bar and saw me with my boyfriend, I could tell right away he was not pleased. Rather than come up to me though, he just kinda glared at us from across the bar. He had the worst look on his face, and even with a couple of drinks in me, I was feeling very uncomfortable. After a few hours had passed by, Charlie finally approached us, with my boyfriend right there beside me. He asked me if I'd broken up with him yet. Brandon, of course, took offense to this, and Charlie began to laugh in his face. He pushed Brandon down onto his bar stool and told me, "Why are you dating this pansy?" Of course, Brandon got up and pushed Charlie, who then pulled out a switchblade. The bouncer was immediately over there and completely manhandled Charlie as he threw him out of the bar. All the while, Charlie just kept screaming that all he wanted was my heart. Even though I was sure Charlie would never be allowed to come back to that bar, I stopped going there altogether. I had been a regular for years, but that experience completely ruined it for me. Many months passed by after, and I'd mostly dismissed the situation with Charlie by now. I'd had a very stressful situation at work though, and I really needed a drink. I figured enough time had passed and it was unlikely Charlie would be allowed back into that bar. So I went to go have a few drinks. The bartender asked me why I hadn't been in for a while, and I just told him I'd been really busy. After having had my fill, I was ready to head on home. Upon arriving, I went to bed pretty quickly. While I was sleeping though, I was suddenly woken up by a strange thumping noise. It was a very rhythmic knocking sound coming through the wall of the house. At first, I tried to ignore it and tried to go back to sleep as well. I'd only dozed off for a very short period of time before the noise woke me right back up. I was a little bit too tired at this point to be scared or concerned. I kept on trying to go back to sleep, but it just wouldn't happen. When this repeated rhythmic sound never stopped, I got up and looked over at the window. I screamed. Charlie was standing at my window looking in at me, holding some kind of animal heart in his hand. He was thumping the side of the wall with his other hand, and he had written in blood on the window, "All I want is your heart." I quickly ran to the phone and dialed 911. The police got there quickly as well, but Charlie had already fled. Fortunately, they picked him up only an hour later. He was charged, but there wasn't much they could really get him for. He insisted it was just a sick way of trying to woo me. It wasn't long before he was set free as well. The man made my life a living hell from then on. He would show up all the time, especially when I least expected it. He never really did anything. He would always just indicate he wanted my heart. I was in hell because I couldn't afford to move, and my boyfriend couldn't always be with me. I had to get a concealed carry permit to protect myself, but I always had to watch it anyway. I never knew when he'd just appear, and I never knew when he would actually do something to me either. A lot of times, the anticipation of something happening to you can be worse than it actually happening. I used to be a manager at a Borders bookstore. It was a pretty good job, and I enjoyed working there a lot. I was an assistant manager who enjoyed when I was the only manager in the store. Because of that, I often volunteered to work all day on holidays and allow the other managers to take the day off as well. This became a very regular thing with me. My first year there, I went ahead and took the opportunity to work on Valentine's Day as well. It wasn't like I was dating anyone at the moment, so it was pretty easy for me to slot in. I agreed to open and close the store, so I was the only manager working the entire day. I spent a large amount of time just taking it easy back in the offices, mostly working on Microsoft Excel sheets for making the schedules for upcoming weeks. I got a page to dial a certain extension. I picked up and called, and one of my employees told me I needed to go over to the security cameras. Apparently, there was someone in the store walking around in a huge bee costume. Naturally, I thought that was quite odd. I went up and went over to the security office. We had 4 televisions in that room, with several cameras that could be switched back and forth between. As I looked over at the monitors, I noticed something over on the camera that was focused in the cafe area. It was exactly what my employee had told me. There was a man that seemed to be dressed in this huge bumblebee costume. He was walking around and bothering the customers. He was also holding what looked like a huge construction paper heart in his hand. I have to admit, I was at a complete loss as to how to handle this situation. I can easily say this was never covered in my management training, nor anything of that sort. I wasn't sure if he was soliciting or harassing, just seemed like he was going around the cafe acting kinda crazy. Well, crazy in my perspective at least. Anybody in a bee costume in a random Borders bookstore had to be a little bit off balance at least. For a few moments, I just kinda watched the guy on the security cameras. He was quite large actually. As he moved around the store, he was sort of dancing back and forth. After a bit of arguing back and forth with myself, I finally decided this must be bad for business. I knew I had to at least go and see what this bee wanted. I walked out of the offices and made my way up to the cash register area. The bee person was just kind of prancing about in front of them. A few people were bent out of shape about it as well. The customers were completely avoiding this man. I wasn't really looking forward to having to confront this person. I tried to get the bee's attention, but he mostly ignored me as he continued to randomly dance around. I followed him around, trying to tell him I was the manager and he was disrupting business, so he had to leave right now. Eventually, out of complete frustration, I told him if he didn't leave the store right this instant, I would call the police and have him removed. Well, that got his attention. The bee had a pen with him and began to scribble something on the construction paper heart he was carrying. He handed it over to me, then began to dance right out the front door of the store. Once the bee was gone, I looked down at what he'd written. "Big B says you're dead." It was weird, but I wasn't really too concerned about it. By the time the store closed, I had put the incident out of my head almost completely. I mean, I hadn't really forgotten about it because honestly, who could ever forget such a weird experience? But I also wasn't putting too much thought into it either. I closed up the store and allowed the other regular employees to go home. After I was done counting up the money and setting up the systems, I went to the security office to turn off the monitors as well. When I did so, I saw the man in the bee costume just standing at the front door of the store. I watched him, holding up another construction paper heart. He turned to display it to the camera, and I saw it read, "Remember what Big B said?" He must have been standing there for a while, because he couldn't have known when I would walk into the office. I decided I would go up to the front of the store and call through the doors to let him know I was going to call the police if he didn't leave. By the time I got there, though, he had already disappeared. I didn't know if I should call the cops if the bee man was really gone. I was really hesitant to leave the store now as well. I went back into the office and watched the monitors for over half an hour. It seemed he wouldn't be coming back anytime soon. When I was finally sure I was safe, I set the alarm for the store and left and locked the doors behind me. I very cautiously walked around to the side where the employees were allowed to park. As I walked around the corner, though, standing just off in the distance, was that damn bee watching me. He had been waiting just out of sight of where the cameras couldn't see him. He was holding a knife this time instead of a heart. Those words from earlier rang through my head. "Big B says you're dead." I began to sprint toward my car as I saw the bee rapidly begin moving toward me. Fortunately, I was closer to my car than he was. I was able to get into it and lock it before he got to me. To my luck as well, the horror movie cliche of the car not starting didn't affect me at all. I started to pull my car out. I almost smacked right into the bee person, which I really didn't mind. I shifted into drive and took off out of that parking lot. As I looked back into the rear view mirror, I saw that bee just dancing around like he'd been doing inside the store. In that moment, I thought to myself, man, that is one sick fucker. I wasn't really sure what I could do about this bee man. I guess I could call the cops, but he was in a costume, so I didn't really have a description of him, other than he was a big guy in a bee costume. I highly doubted he would still be wearing it when they arrived there. Any big guy I saw around the store could have been him. Any big guy I'd see in the parking lot in the future could also be him. It made every night at work a nightmare, and I never left the building alone at night again. My junior high school crush was named Adam. Yes, I'm a guy, and yes, I am gay. I was out at the time, and no one really had much of a problem with it seemed. I mean, there was always going to be some jerks around who'd make some lame comments or throw stupid insults at you for something you had no control over, but for the most part, no one really gave me a hard time. Although I had a huge crush on Adam, I was never disrespectful about it, and I was positive that he never knew. A lot of guys always freak out that they may be in the locker room being stared at by a gay guy or whatever. Well, if you were, it wasn't going to be me. I hated the whole locker room experience. Mostly I'd just do my thing, change, and leave. I tried not to stare too long when I saw him in the hallway either. When you have a crush on someone, it's best to not make them uncomfortable. I was already very happy just having my crush and knowing that he would never know about it. My best friend Tammy, though, thought I should just tell him that I liked him. She told me that everyone in the school knew I was gay anyway, so what could it hurt in the end? If he wanted to kick my ass for being gay or whatever, he would have done it a long time ago. At worst, he'd just tell me that he didn't like me back and wasn't interested. I'd be heartbroken for a little while or whatever, but at least I'd have it out of my system. Well, despite Tammy's encouragement, I never had the courage to go through. She wasn't as shy about it as I was, though. One day in the cafeteria, about a week before Valentine's Day, she actually just went up and told Adam that I liked him. I didn't know what his reaction was. I was too embarrassed and humiliated to stay for it. I very quickly ran out of there. For the next week, I just did my best to avoid him altogether. Tammy told me that Adam hadn't believed her and hadn't said much else. I don't know, seemed like a weak explanation to me. He was obviously uncomfortable with the revelation, and Tammy's idea had backfired. Now I was too shy to even look at him at all. Tammy apologized profusely, of course, but she insisted it was better to know that he was not interested for sure. I wasn't so convinced, though. On Valentine's Day, I left the school right after it let out without talking to anyone, not even Tammy. There was this small wooded area behind the school I used to go through on my way home. As I was walking up to it, though, this time I heard someone call out my name from behind me. Looking back, I was very shocked to see Adam running up to me. My heart started beating rapidly, more out of fear than anything else, honestly. When he got up to me, though, he had this huge smile on his face. "Thanks for stopping," Adam said, smiling at me. "I wanted to give you something." "What is it?" I asked, still thinking it was going to be a knuckle sandwich. Adam reached into his book bag and pulled out a heart-shaped box of Valentine's chocolates. I'd be happy if you'd share some of these with me." I was so overjoyed I couldn't even respond. All I could do was nod with the biggest shit-eating grin in history spread across my face. Adam and I sat down behind a tree. He opened up the box of chocolates and held them out to me. I took one and ate it. He set the box on his lap as he talked to me. Once I was done with the first piece, he offered me another. He talked about more things to me, but at this point I could barely understand a word he was saying. I was so elated. By the time I'd gotten 5 pieces in, I was giddy as hell. It was then that I took note that Adam hadn't eaten a single piece of the candy. I looked over at him as he was talking, and realized I really had no idea what he was even saying to me. It wasn't that I was so elated I didn't understand. I could see his lips moving, but I couldn't understand any of the words he was saying. As I laid back against the tree, I saw Adam reach over to me. He grabbed my jacket and began to pull it off me. Everything seemed to disappear for a moment. I can't really explain it. It's like nothing was there. I couldn't tell if it was a short time or a long time or no time at all. I opened my eyes. Adam had taken my shirt off and was pulling my belt off and unbuttoning my jeans, and was confused. Did Adam just slip me a date rape drug? He knew I had a crush on him. Why did he think he needed to slip me anything? He began to pull my jeans off, and that was really the last thing I remembered. When I began to come around, I felt very weird. At first, I had no idea where I was, or how I'd even gotten there. There was some pain in my groin, but the confusion was worse. I looked around. I was alone, and it was pitch black. I appeared to be naked as well. As I looked down, my head cleared, and I could see why I was in pain. My crotch was completely covered in ants. Looking at the ground, I saw a huge column of them on their way to and from me. I tried to get up, but I was too groggy at first. I tried to shoo the ants off as well, but I was sticky. I didn't know what they were doing to cause so much pain. I tried to get up, and when I first did, I landed on my arm against the tree, breaking it. The pain helped me become a bit more aware, though. I got up and shooed the ants off me still, although it didn't do any good. It seemed I wasn't too far away from the school. I looked around, but I couldn't find my clothes anywhere. The only thing I had to cover myself with was the leftover Valentine's Day box. I ignored the pain in my crotch and my broken arm, holding the box over me and running to the school. A few people saw me and laughed their asses off. I finally made it, though, and was taken to the nurse's office and then to the hospital. Unfortunately, once I got cleaned off, my crotch was very red and very sore. It looked like there was going to be some permanent scarring once it healed. It didn't seem like there was any major damage to the organs themselves, fortunately. Apparently, Adam and his buddies hadn't planned this out very well. My arm was put into a cast, of course, my first one ever. I was too embarrassed by the whole thing to even tell people Adam had done it. I kept the explanation to myself. For nearly 2 weeks, I was in complete pain whenever I walked around. I had to take the laughs of my peers, but nothing hurt worse than the laughs of Adam and his friends whenever I saw them from then on. The worst part of this all was 5 years later. I saw Adam again, dancing in a gay bar. So I guess he actually was gay, which made this whole gay-bashing incident even worse. I was still pissed at him for what he did. Fortunately, though, I knew some big, strong guys who were good friends of mine, and they weren't opposed to helping me get some revenge on my high school crush. This is a close call with a stranger I had when I was younger. It's something I didn't fully realize the severity of until I was much older. My mom had left me and my brother home alone this day. It was around midday, I think. My brother was 12, maybe 13, and I was 9 years old. I was just kinda watching him play Xbox in our living room. He had his headset on and was talking to his friends when there was a knock on the door from our carport. I ran over and answered the door without even looking. It was a grown man I had never seen before. We were still separated by the screen door, but at the time it was unlocked. "Hey there, Missy. Are your parents home?" A bit of horror washed over me. First of all, he was knocking from the carport, which was strange in and of itself. Wouldn't a stranger go knock on your front door? Our carport was empty as well. We only had one car, and my mother had taken it out. The man definitely knew my parents weren't home. I was afraid. I wasn't quite sure why yet, but I knew I was scared. Immediately, my brother in the other room came to mind. I never had a father figure growing up. My brother had always been the one to make me feel safe. The strongest person in the entire world to me. Someone who could protect me in any situation. But he was doing something else right now. I began to feel as though I could barely speak. Wide-eyed, I managed to at least stutter out, My big brother's here." Without even a moment's pause, though, the man reached for the screen door and started to pull it open. Like an act of divine intervention, an arm reached out behind me over my shoulder and grabbed the door. My brother rushed past me, holding the door and forcing the man back. The man sprinted out of the carport and closed the door behind him. The man came back around to the front and told my brother he was looking to buy some shitty old swing set that was in our front yard at the time. My brother came back in without saying anything to me. He put on his headset and continued playing. I sat down as well and continued to watch him, and the man left soon after. I don't believe we ever told our mom. Luckily, I never encountered this person again, and it almost faded from my memory. As I got older and started to understand more, though, it became one of the scariest things that ever happened to me. Maybe creepy not so much because of what actually happened, but what easily could have. It was unnerving how absolutely oblivious both of us were. I like to think the man was planning to just lock me in a room, rob the place, and leave immediately after. But who knows? People can be so evil. There was this one time I was staying at my uncle's for a while. I wasn't on the best terms with my stepdad, and it was the only option I had financially at the time. My uncle lived in what I would nicely describe as a very, very redneck poor part of town. There were only 2 roads that led to my uncle's place. One was the long way back into town, and the other was the straight shot, where there stood a supermarket right on the edge of town. There was also a short bridge that continued into a very long, very scarcely lit stretch of road for about 3 miles, and that led to where my uncle lived. When I first arrived, we were driving over that bridge, and my uncle turned and said to me, "Be careful around this bridge at night, son. There are meth addicts that live underneath, and they get up to all kinds of crazy stuff." I didn't think much of that because I'd just arrived there. A month or so later, though, I was working in town at a restaurant that I had to ride my skateboard to because I had no car at the time. One night, after an evening shift at around 12 a.m., I realized I had to use the restroom, and the only thing open was that supermarket. I headed that way since I was already going home, and this was an emergency stop, so to speak. There was no way I was going to make it 3 miles home by skateboard without crapping myself. After a nice, relaxing relieving of myself, I was skating across the wooden bridge, thinking about how much noise I was making on this old rickety thing. That's when I realized, damn it, I'm on the Meth Bridge right now. I popped my board back into my hand and tried to walk as quietly as possible the rest of the way. I really did not want to be noticed right now. Keep in mind this road was very dark. There were only streetlights every 100 yards at most. I was a little ways past the bridge now, thinking about how loud I had been. I was wondering if anyone had heard me, so I did a shoulder check, only to see someone in one of those definitely a homeless meth head windbreaker jackets at the light I had just passed. The instant he noticed I'd seen him, he did this awkward pause and started to look around as if we weren't the only 2 people on this long, dark road. Then he looked me dead in the eyes. It was weird, man. Like I knew it was trouble by the way his posture was and how hard he was trying to look inconspicuous. Still though, that street was as straight as an arrow, and no one had been behind me before I crossed that bridge. I kept on walking, calm at first. Then I checked over my shoulder again. The man was even closer now, and gaining on me with every second. I started to increase my speed. At some point I checked and he was even closer. I just started sprinting. There was a street ahead, a little less than a quarter mile away. I didn't think I'd make it though. I decided I'd have to run off the road into the brush and hop a random fence. There were plenty of ranches around here, so imagine how spread out everything was. Now I'm running full speed through some random person's property, probably scaring all sorts of animals. I jumped the front fence of said property and hid in a bush near their driveway. My only game plan was to swing my board at his face and try to run for my life again. Well, unfortunately for me, the owner of that property just so happened to be arriving home in his pickup truck and was obviously quite pissed to see me hiding in his bushes. He ran over and started screaming at me as to why I was crouched in a bush at the end of his driveway. The whole time he was yelling at me, though, I was explaining that I was being followed by someone. That exact moment is when I saw the silhouette of the man following me right on the other side of the bush. I could tell he'd heard me. He slowly started to back away, him making eye contact the whole time as he retreated. I knew that he'd just heard me trying to explain myself. The owner of the property saw that guy too and stopped his screaming at me right away. In fact, he chilled with me for a minute or two. When I asked for a ride, he said he couldn't help me, unfortunately. I had to walk the rest of the way back to my uncle's by myself. That shit was crazy and scary. A pretty gnarly one for me. Really felt like I was being hunted. This happened 10 years ago when I was 19 years old. I was working at a factory at the time and shared a one-bedroom apartment with a former friend of mine. She let me take the only bedroom, and since the living room was huge anyway, she just slept under the big bay window with a privacy screen between her bed and the couch. Anyway, we used to always joke about this particular building being haunted. A guy had died in our apartment by suicide years before, and sometimes out of the corner of your eye or whatever, you could swear you'd see a person standing in the bathtub behind the curtain or sitting in the chair in the living room. Of course, every time you'd go to look, there would be nothing there. We only ever saw anything though when the window was open. As long as that window was kept closed, there would be no problems. I guess that could easily be explained away as group hysteria or whatever. One night though, as we were sitting there shooting the shit, there was this faint knock at the door, almost barely audible. We were both a little bit unsettled. Something about this just didn't seem right. I can't explain though what about it sounded so off. All I know is I went into fight mode immediately. The mom genes were strong even back then. I grabbed my knife, which I used for scaring away rambunctious drunks, and walked slowly over to the door. Right as I went to reach for the knob, it turned and started to open. I yanked it open the rest of the way, only to see there was nobody there. I saw the doorknob turn. My roommate saw it turn too. I yanked that door open and searched up and down the hallway. There was nothing there. All of a sudden, as I turned around, I heard this sound like someone sprinting up the stairs to the second floor. It scared the hell out of me right then and there. I slammed the door shut as hard as I could. Maybe it was because I'd heard footsteps, but no breathing or any other sounds. It just really unnerved me. I slammed the door, locked it, locked the deadbolt, locked the other deadbolt, and put the chain on too. I propped a dining chair up against the handle for good measure, then went and did the same thing to the door in the kitchen. I closed every curtain so nobody could see inside my apartment either, and we both slept in my bed together that night. I'd never hugged that knife so tight in my entire life. I don't know if it was a ghost or what, but 2 months later I moved out of that apartment and into the one upstairs, and things there were even worse. On a Friday night, I fell asleep on the couch, and my husband tiptoed to bed to let me rest. I'd been having some trouble sleeping and was recovering from a sinus infection at the time. Our couch was pushed right up against a wall, just below a window. Our cat often liked to walk or sit on the back of the couch and try to look out that window. We tried to remember to keep the blinds cracked a little so she could at least see out. Our house was fairly high off the ground. My husband is around 6'4", and when he's at the ground level, I can only barely see his mouth from the top of his head through the window. Anyway, I was sleeping. A sound woke me up, and in my grogginess, I thought it must be the cat fucking with the blinds to peek out again. That was pretty normal behavior for her. In my sleep, I kind of rolled over and vaguely swatted at the back of the couch behind my head. I grumbled something at her too. Usually that was enough to get her to stop. The sound continued though. This time it was a bit different. I was still mostly half asleep, but suddenly there was some sort of metallic scratching. I opened my eyes, now very confused. I sat, stood up, and turned around, fully expecting my cat to have found some more annoying way to mess with my sleep, only to lock eyes with a man who was now prying my window open. I saw from the nose up. His eyes got real big. I screamed. He started to run away. I yelled and my husband grabbed his gun. The cops were called as well. It turned out that more than 5 homes in our area were broken into that very night. In more than one instance, the man had entered the home and poked around, stole things, ate food, even left without the owners ever waking. Had he managed to get into our house when he crawled through that window, he would have landed right on top of me, and who knows what he would have done then. When I was younger, around 15-ish or so, I was part of my local guide troupe. We went to an annual fair/show thing, where you could go and buy bags of stuff, see wood chopping, go on rides, etc. I kept on getting this feeling throughout that something wasn't right all day. Every time I turned around, I would see it, a clown, following me and my friends around. The same clown every time I looked behind us. It watched my group when we were heading towards where the train platform was even, followed us the whole day. It was a horrible feeling I'd never forgotten. And a few years after the clown incident, I suddenly felt it once again. I was just finishing up my shift at work when I noticed an older man hanging around the front of my store, near where I was situated. No big deal, right? Probably just waiting for someone. I left and headed down to wait for my bus home, completely oblivious, except for that odd feeling in my stomach. I sat down to wait for the bus, only for the old guy to walk by me and sit a little bit further down away from me. Okay, seemed he wasn't with anyone then. I got on my bus and sat to the left of the driver at the front. The guy also got on as well. At this point, I was thinking, well, I'll just get off a few stops early and see if it really is just a weird coincidence. I got off, only for the man to get off too. I walked briskly across the road, over a couple of empty lots, to the nearest block of shops and walked in. I looked at the lady behind the counter and whispered to her, "I think some guy is following me. Can you act like I have an appointment, please?" The man waited outside for a moment, but eventually he disappeared. Me and a couple of the ladies looked out the front and back, but we couldn't find him anywhere. I dead sprinted home, jumped into my house, and closed all my blinds and chained the door shut. I was texting my mom while having a panic attack and watching through a slit in the blinds. I could see the old man, now walking back and forth through my neighborhood multiple times. I ran to the kitchen and laid down on the floor, away from all my windows, until my mom came home finally. I didn't see the man again after she arrived, although that man did seem a bit similar to that clown I'd seen all those years ago. This has been on my mind a lot lately, so maybe sharing it will help me get some of this off my chest. So, my father is a criminal, a violent criminal, but I didn't know that when I was little. I didn't know what my father was. To me, he was my daddy, my hero. He protected me from bad dreams and taught me all sorts of things. Sure, sometimes he got mad and hit me or pulled on my hair, and sometimes he thought it was funny to put dead spiders in my hair just to scare me. But I thought this was normal stuff all dads did to their kids. Dads were supposed to discipline their kids and pick on them every now and then, right? My dad loved me. I didn't know, though, that the man I thought was a superhero was really a monster. Then came the night my whole world changed. My life changed. On this particular night, me and my younger brother were in deep sleep when we were suddenly awoken to the sound of a woman's desperate screaming. I was 8 and my brother was 7. It was the most terrifying sound we'd ever heard. We heard her screaming and begging for her life. my dad's voice yelling in anger. And what I now know was the sound of him beating her. Of course, I didn't know what was going on. I only knew my dad must be doing something terrible to that woman. The man I thought was my dad wouldn't hurt anyone who wasn't trying to hurt us. I thought he was a good person. When I realized he was the bad guy, I couldn't trust anything anymore. I didn't know what to do. I didn't know if he was going to come after us for hearing this. I just knew I had to protect my little brother in that moment. My dad heard us crying and burst into the room. I hugged my brother as tight as I could, while my dad screamed at us. Thankfully, he didn't do anything to us other than throw a few things around us. He went back out and began beating the woman once again. I kept holding my brother, rocking him back and forth, telling him not to cry. Everything was going to be okay soon. Then we heard a gunshot. Our grandfather was a hunter, so we knew what guns did, and we knew they killed things. For a few seconds of silence after that gunshot, I really thought my dad had just killed that woman, and maybe we might be next. I was actually thankful when she began to scream again. Screams at least meant she was still alive. I don't know how long I sat in that room holding my brother, trying to figure out what to do, how to get help. We had to listen to that woman suffer, being terrified we'd be next. Eventually, my dad moved the woman away from the room we were in, and then he left altogether. Turns out he'd hog-tied her and chained her up in a doghouse. Sometime after that, the cops came and took us away from that home. It's been 16 years since that happened, and every night I still have nightmares of that woman screaming. So this happened a few years back, when I was living in a suburban area. I used to ride my longboard around at night and just glide through the sleeping streets as a way to relax and wind down from work. I always rode my board alone. One night I was riding my board as usual, crossing through intersections, when I started getting to the end of the street and into a new one. It was a cloudy night, but the streets were lit with various street lamps. A little bit further up the road, underneath one of these lamps, I thought I could see a man standing there. He seemed to be in a full-body suit, all black. I slowed my board down and nervously laughed, calling out to the man, "Hey, that's a nice costume." The man's head shot up to look at me, but he didn't say a word. At this point, I picked up my board and was now holding it. The man slowly started to stumble towards me, and my mind went blank. For some reason, I didn't jump back on my board. I just started running away from him as fast as I could. When I looked back, I could see he was now sprinting after me. I had never been so scared in my life. As I continued to run down the street, I found a family sitting outside on their porch. I approached them, as I realized what I was about to say sounded batshit crazy. I told them about the man in the bodysuit, and they let me stay on the porch with them to blend in. After a few more minutes, we saw the man come walking down the street, doing some bizarre motion, waving his upper body back and forth. We watched as the man glanced over at us and then continued to walk down the street in this strange motion before disappearing around a corner. Thankfully, the family were nice enough to drive me home and not make me walk all the way back with that guy out there, because I sure didn't feel safe doing that this night. To this day, I still don't know what that was. Sometimes I maybe think I even just saw something. Maybe because it was around Halloween and somebody just thought they were being funny. I don't know, but this was one of my worst experiences ever. I saw a drive-by shooting not even a month ago. My wife and I had decided to go to a food truck meet at our local park, figuring it would be a nice outdoor adventure for our 8-month-old son. Driving down that street, there are generally cars parked on both sides, and this day was no exception. As we approached this row of cars, a white minivan turned onto the road headed towards us. Being a nice guy, I stopped to let him through first. Except he didn't come all the way down. He stopped about 15 feet in front of us. All of a sudden, he pulled out a gun and started shooting at the people right in front of us. In no way do we live in a bad neighborhood. It was typical suburbia. One man was shot and killed pretty much instantly. A second girl was shot in the back while running away, blood pouring from the wounds in her back. I threw my car in reverse and slammed it to try and get out of there. After that guy had finished shooting that couple, he hauled ass towards my family. Now we were in reverse, trying to get away from this situation. That's all I could think to do. The man continued to drive towards us and tried to box us in with his car. My eyes locked with his. In that moment, I felt a feeling I couldn't describe or even knew existed before. Bone-chilling would be just the tip of the iceberg in description. I had never been more fearful in my entire life. All I was focused on was the safety of my wife and son. The man raised his gun as if to shoot, and then he simply drove away. It shook us up bad enough to want to move far away, and at the end of the month, we're moving out of state to a quiet mountain town, and I'm gonna try my best not to think about it again. A few weeks ago on a Saturday night, I let my dog Riley into the backyard. He was out there for about 10 minutes, so I opened the back door to call him inside. He didn't come right away though, which was weird because he usually did. I closed the back door and waited. After about 5 or so minutes, I opened the back door once more to let him in. "Riley!" I called. No response. "Riley, come inside. It's time for bed." Again, no response. This is where things started to get weird. I whistled for him to come back. Then, from the other side of the yard, I heard someone whistle back. The exact same whistle I just whistled. "What the fuck?" I muttered under my breath. I thought it must have just been my imagination, so I whistled again. And again, this mystery person whistled back. I shut the door and locked it right away. I went to my grandparents' bedroom and peeked out the window to see if I could see anything. There was nothing there, it seemed. I went back to the kitchen, where the back door was, and flipped the porch light on. I went back to the bedroom, looked out that window too, and again there was nothing to be seen. After that, I decided to go to the living room and tell my grandparents what had just happened. My grandpa told me to grab a flashlight and Riley's leash and check it out myself. He said the whistling was probably just the neighbors across the alley. I grabbed a flashlight and Riley's leash and turned off the porch light because I was afraid of what I might see with it on. So afraid, in fact, I didn't even know if I planned to use the flashlight either. I was a small, skinny 16-year-old male and not good at fighting either. As soon as I stepped out into the cold, dark night, I wished I had gone to my room and retrieved a baseball bat instead of a flashlight. Slowly, I made my descent of the front porch steps. I know I must sound like a little wuss right now, but that shit was fucking scary. One time last year in the middle of the night, I'd heard someone slam the cellar door shut. That had scared me so badly. I was even more scared now. I stopped on the second to last step and looked out into the yard. I finally got enough courage to call out. "Riley?" I called. From right behind me, I heard a soft voice whisper in my ear. "Riley." I turned to see a face peering at me from underneath the porch. I couldn't even scream. The face peering at me was crazed, looked like a crackhead, which was common from where I live. I ran up the stairs. I threw a kick into the dude's face between the spaces so he couldn't grab at me as I ran. Then I jumped inside. I told my grandpa what happened. He grabbed his gun and came back out with me. We searched the whole yard. No sign of that crazy guy, nor my dog Riley. The back gate was wide open, and there was blood on the stairs where that man's face was at. Blood, I guess, maybe from his lip or something. The cops were called, of course, and I explained everything to them. After they spoke to me, they left. Haven't heard anything from them since. Thankfully, the next morning we found Riley perfectly fine, just standing in some random person's driveway. That was good, at least. My guess as to what happened is that the crazy man had already been in my yard when I let Riley out. Riley must have discovered he left the gate open and left to wander around. It was a pretty terrifying experience. I'm just glad my dog wasn't hurt in the end. At the time this happened, I lived in Missouri. When I was about 5 or 6 years old, I was sound asleep in my bed one night. It had to be at least after midnight at this point. Very suddenly, I was awoken out of my sleep, only to see a strange man standing over me with his hands wrapped around my wrists. The moonlight slightly illuminated my room, and I could make out the man's face sort of. Mostly his thick mustache. I was overcome with fear in that moment and began to scream my head off. The man rushed out of my room immediately, and not even a few moments later, my parents rushed in to see what was wrong. I was crying my eyes out and told them what had just happened. My dad thoroughly searched the house, but nothing was found that night. My parents did their best to calm me down, and my mother slept by my side until I fell asleep. Later that very same night, even further into the evening, that same thing happened again. This time, though, he was a lot gentler with grabbing my wrists. I imagine he thought if he was a little more gentle, he would be able to kidnap me while I was asleep. I'll never forget the shriek I made in that moment. You can't even begin to imagine the fear. That person was somehow in my home once again and trying to take me away forever. Once again, he ran away. My parents let me sleep in their bed for the rest of the night. When I finally became a teenager, my mom and I were talking about that incident. She told me that apparently, while I was outside playing with my dad earlier that day, she was bathing my 6-month-old brother when she'd noticed someone walk past the bathroom quietly as possible. At that point, alarm bells were going off in her head, of course. She then began to hear these strange noises coming from the bedroom. She wrapped my brother up in a towel and carried him in her arms. She went outside as fast as she could. She thought the man was trying to bait her to come inside alone. My father went into the house instead and checked everywhere, but there was no one to be found. My parents' theory is that they were somehow able to get in from the back door, which led to the unfinished basement. What creeps me out, though, is that he was so quiet. Everything in the home remained untouched when he intruded. I always think about what would have happened if I just slept through all of that. I could have easily been kidnapped, or even worse, killed. My parents wanted to get out of this house as soon as possible. Of course we didn't feel safe. They sold it ASAP and moved us into a 2-bedroom apartment while our new house was being built elsewhere. I was very sad to move, of course, and I missed my friends a whole lot, but my safety was more important than anything else. So, heads up for right now. This story is actually supremely fucked up. The story is that I went on a website kind of like Facebook, but it wasn't exactly. I guess I'll call it tea time. It was around 2010, and I went on there basically religiously every day. I was quite young and also somewhat dumb. A 14-year-old female. It sounds like a cheesy as hell start, but it was actually quite terrible. As this cheesiness goes, I found a couple of friends on there. Around 5 who I became close with. We didn't instantly become friends though. Gradually grew closer over time. They knew what country and state I lived in, but that was basically it. I was really scared of being stalked by people online. I knew basically just as much about them, because we were friends online, but that was about all. After a year though, I got more close with one of the guys specifically. Things got more intimate, I guess I'd say. He lived all the way on the other side of the country. He'd been planning to meet me for a while, but I didn't quite trust him yet, you know? We were all supposedly around the same age. and had similar interests as well. I just happened to connect with this particular guy the most of all. Eventually, I stopped using tea time. I had school, and I realized something was kind of weird after one of them accidentally called me by my real name. I told them my name was some pseudonym or something. That made me so scared, I deleted that account right away and never logged back on. Then I completely forgot all about that messaging app. Well, what I hadn't seen in the meantime was all of the threatening messages sent to me over and over, telling me to get back on tea time or else. That person didn't seem to care about me at all. He told me my address, my full legal name, where I went to school. He then told me that he and the other guys had intentions of kidnapping me for their boss, some guy named Carlos or something. A very racist Mexican stereotype they'd crafted. I was so scared. I started skipping school, putting up cameras all over the place, wearing different clothes and even changing my hair. November 2012, they finally showed up at my house one day out of nowhere, a day I'd skipped school. They'd brought pistols with them, it seemed, and what looked to be a machete type of knife. I did what I thought was best at the time. I hid in the closet in my room and called the police right away. The faces they made while searching my house for me will haunt me to this day. They made me feel super insecure about myself while insulting me, and told me all the crazy and sadistic things they would do to me if they found me, cutting my skin open, breaking all of my fingers, shoving the knife up my ass. I was mortified. I was so scared in that moment, I forced the lock on my closet so it would stay locked from the inside. When the police arrived, it took them 5 minutes to break me out. I was crying my eyes out, and I was more scared than I'd ever been. Somehow, the police weren't able to catch those guys. I never found my closure. I did find some further information on them, though, because of others who seemed to have similar problems. It turned out that each of these guys was apparently 40 years old. There was a guy that picked people who looked particularly young to pretend to be young girls and boys and try to befriend kids online. To this day, I still haven't told anyone really. Many times after, I'd skip school out of paranoia and try to play it off as just being sick. I did my best to change everything about me so they wouldn't recognize me again. I have extreme trust issues now. I feel like sharing this did help me get it a bit off my chest. Before then, I'd only told the police and other people involved in the investigation what happened to me. When people say to be careful on the internet, please be sure to keep that in mind. So this was a really weird experience that happened to me. I went out rock hounding solo today to a place my husband and I have gone to many times before. Everything seemed fairly normal when I arrived. It's a fairly secluded area of the creek, with a rock bar in the middle and a small patch of woods to the left. There's a far denser forest off to the right. I crossed the creek and set up my gear on the rock bar. I grabbed a bag and started walking up along the creek. About 45 minutes into this, I kept on glancing up at the forest. I didn't know why at first, but I just kept on getting this eerie feeling. Every now and again, I'd hear a couple of thumps somewhere out there in the woods. But, it's nature. I tried not to think too much of it. After about 15 minutes more, though, I suddenly heard a very quiet meow. I was so focused on pulling up clay that I instantly stood up. I was extremely confused. I couldn't have just heard a house cat meowing out here, could I? 10 minutes went by. I was now walking further up the creek, and damned would I be if I didn't hear it again. I stopped instantly. I'd for sure just heard a cat's meow. How strange. But something seemed really off about it. I started to feel real uneasy now. I turned around and headed back to my site. Something about the sound I'd heard wasn't quite right. It was like a matter-of-fact meow, if that makes sense. I don't know how else to explain it. About 5 minutes into the trek, I could hear that meowing sound behind me now. I was sweating like crazy because of the heat, but that instantly made me feel cold and clammy. The hair stood up on the back of my neck. I knew what I was supposed to be hearing, a single meow, but it wasn't coming from a cat. The sound was now closer, and I could tell it sounded like someone imitating a cat's meow. I kept focused on getting back to my sight. 5 minutes later, another meow from behind me. This is where I realized that things were getting really concerning now. And that sound was coming from the same distance behind me, no matter how far I kept walking, or how fast. Finally, I reached my sight once more. I pulled out my drinks and took a moment to rehydrate. That's when another cat's meow sounded right next to me. This time, I knew with everything in me, this was not a cat following me. I calmly gathered up my gear and began the trek across the creek to the path to my car. This time, right from behind my ear, a meow came. I sprinted across the creek and hunched down in a pit. I'd parked my car right next to the edge of the forest, and I was really starting to lose my shit now. I grabbed my keys and mace out and put my gear on me so I could dive into my car and rearrange later. That's exactly what I did. I dove right in. I nearly shit myself having to take the opportunity to find the courage and sprint out to my car, but I did so, and I hightailed it out of there as fast as possible. I want to hear your guys' thoughts on this. The rational answer is that someone was just screwing at me, but why would they be so far out into the woods? It was like 200 acres of forest. I just don't know. So I've been waiting a long time to tell the full story of the Whistler. This story requires many details, but is unexplainable, creepy, and 100% true. When I was about 8 years old, I was taking my dog for a walk through the neighborhood with my mother. It was maybe 11 p.m. or so. We lived right next to a swampy woods area on the edge of our neighborhood in Lansing, Michigan. I remember it was very silent and slightly windy as well. From somewhere down out in the swamp, we could hear someone whistling at us. It sounded sort of like a bird at first, but each whistle was different enough, where the lack of consistency made it sound human-like. I can't really even begin to describe it. My mom had this concerned, terrified look on her face. She grabbed my hand and said we should go back inside quickly. I didn't understand because I was too young, but seeing my mom freak out made me freak out too. After a while, though, I just kinda forgot about it. 2 years later, I was taking my dog out again, this time late at night. There was a large bush that could easily obscure a person behind it, right next to our front door. As I was finishing up our night walk, that whistling noise started again. Same pitches, same inconsistent human-like tones. As soon as I heard it, a chill went down my spine. I remembered that exact feeling of seeing my mom terrified, looking out into the swamp at something I couldn't see. I ran inside as fast as possible. The years continued to go by, and I thought about it less and less over time. I only told a handful of people, and it slipped my mind altogether. I mean, it happens so infrequently. Fast forward to last summer. I was now 24 and started dating my girl Sarah. We moved out to South Dakota for work. For Independence Day, we decided to go to Pierre, South Dakota, and watch the fireworks along the bank of the Missouri River. There was a free camping spot just behind a hospital where you could pitch up your tent, hang out, and see the fireworks together up the river. We were near the end of the campground, and there were very few people around us. As it was getting dark, the fireworks began to pop off. They were pretty far away, so the illumination they brought us was very little. We actually had to sit right at the edge of the river to be able to see them. A giant thunderhead was moving in, and it seemed a storm was imminent. The air seemed almost electric, and the wind was now picking up. The atmosphere was quite eerie, to say the least. The police had herded all the other boats off of the river and had left our area to do that elsewhere as well. Most of the other campers were walking along the riverbank to get a better view of the fireworks. Sarah and I just kinda stayed back, drinking PBR tall boys and kicking it. Suddenly, we began to hear the sound of a paddle methodically dipping into the water. We saw a figure steering a canoe about 20 meters offshore. Sarah decided to go get some more beers from the car, leaving me all alone to stare at this mystery person. All of a sudden, they started to whistle at me. My entire body was frozen, covered in goosebumps. It was that exact same whistling sound from my childhood, now more than a decade later. I looked over to that figure. It was much too dark to discern who it could be. They seemed to be wearing a big hat. When perpendicular to the shore from me, they stopped paddling altogether. They turned the canoe to face directly at me and began to whistle at me once more. I was so frightened I jumped up and shouted at them, "Who are you?" They didn't say anything, just whistled a couple of more lines, then turned the canoe 180 degrees and paddled all the way out of sight. I'm a videographer, so I already had my camera by my side and was taking video of the fireworks at that moment. As the canoe was almost out of sight, I grabbed my camera and got a shot of them whistling as they paddled away. When Sarah came back from getting beers, she was very confused as to why I was so freaked out now. When I explained, she freaked out a bit too. I was convinced we would both be murdered or something that night. How would this whistling person manage to follow me after 14 years all the way to South Dakota? Was it just a coincidence? Why were they whistling the exact same tune then? Who was that person, and where were they going? So many questions were left unanswered. To this day, I'm more afraid of being outside in the dark, where I might hear that whistling once again. I'm open to any explanations. I was recently reminded of an experience I had back in October. I thought my previous experience was my one and only weird backwoods experience, but I guess I was mistaken. Where I live, we have relatively few COVID cases. There were almost none back in the fall. Because of that, although there were certain restrictions still, we had more public health-sanctioned freedoms than many other places. For example, at the time we were permitted to share our social bubble with one other household and travel within our region. My family and our fellow bubble family decided to take advantage of this by going on a fall getaway together. We rented 2 side-by-side cabins in a beautiful waterfront wooded area and had a lovely, relaxing weekend. Although there were other cabins nearby, they were all unoccupied, and we saw no other people there, though we did hear a dog barking a few times somewhere not far off. On our final night there, my son decided to sleep in the other cabin with his bubble buddies. Around 11 p.m. he called me over, asking for some forgotten thing. It was very dark that night, and there were certainly no streetlights in this deeply wooded cabin area. I grabbed my flashlight and began to walk the short distance to the neighboring cabin to deliver whatever it was he'd forgotten. While on my walk back, though, I began to hear a whistling. It was a very human-sounding whistle, the kind someone would make when calling back a dog or something. It sounded very close to me. Shining my light around into the woods, though, I couldn't see anybody there. I heard it once more. I'd assumed it was someone whistling for the dog we'd heard earlier, so I didn't think much of it in that moment. A short time later, another call came from next door. It seemed my son couldn't settle down and wanted to come back over to our cabin. This time, my husband and I walked over together. We collected our child and his things and said goodnight to our bubble family and walked back. We heard the same whistle again now, multiple times. It seemed to be on the dirt road just ahead of us, gradually moving away. My husband commented their dog must have gotten loose or something, and the owner was out looking for it. Inside our cabin, we continued to hear that whistling, coming at irregular intervals every 2 to 4 minutes or so. At first, it would be quite loud and seem right next to us. Then it would gradually grow fainter, then stop as though they'd moved completely out of earshot. Then they would circle around again, coming from the other direction, getting louder as they moved past our cabin, fading once more into the distance. This happened over and over again. Still not thinking that much of it, my husband climbed into the loft to go to sleep, while I started to pack for the trip home the next day. Our son was sleeping in a little room on the main floor to the left of the front door, and the small window in his room was cracked open just a bit to let in some unseasonably warm night air. I was sitting by that window, quietly gathering up his scattered things, when the whistling once again drew closer. This time, though, instead of fading as they passed by, it sounded very close and incredibly loud, as though this person was just outside my son's window now. The blinds were down, but I was absolutely sure I could make out someone standing on the front porch outside. I leapt to the front door and flung it open. I threw on the porch light, ready to tell off this prankster on our doorstep, only to see nobody was there. I grabbed my flashlight and took a few steps out past that circle of light. I began to hear the whistling again. I thought better of this and retreated back inside. I locked up the cabin tight. I closed and latched all the windows and lowered all the blinds. If someone was creeping around outside our cabin, I didn't want them looking in at us from the darkness. Deciding I now did not want to leave my sleeping son downstairs by himself, I settled down on the sofa with a book. The whistling continued around our cabin. Between each sound, I would try to convince myself it must just be a bird or an animal, only to hear it once more and be absolutely certain it was a human being. Around 1:30 a.m., my husband suddenly leapt up and started to get dressed. I asked him what he was doing. "I'm gonna go find out whoever that is and ask them why they've been doing this for hours," he said, obviously quite angry. I was horrified. My husband is a pretty big guy. I was as curious as he was, but I felt deep in my gut that it would not be safe for him to go out and confront that person. I insisted he simply keep me company for the night, and thankfully he did. I sat there vigil, listening to the intermittent whistles all around us. It was at least an hour, until I got so exhausted I dozed off on the sofa. When I woke up, it was the next morning. The sun was now peeking around the blinds, and the whistling had long since stopped. I cautiously peered outside, half expecting to see some sort of evidence of a nighttime intruder. There was nothing there. A while later, we wandered next door, coffee mugs in hand, to get our friend's take on this mystery whistler. Amazingly, they'd not heard a single thing that night, despite the fact we'd heard that sound over and over around our cabin. Clearly, that person would have had to have passed by them to go back around. We couldn't understand how they'd not heard it. I guess maybe they hadn't done it when they were going around them. At checkout, I asked the woman at the kiosk down the road about this. She gave me this real strange look and said she didn't have any idea what I was talking about. When I got home, I searched for audios of bird calls common to the area, even ones not common in the area, in hopes of finding that same whistle somewhere on there. Nothing I found was even close. We still don't know what that was that night, circling for hours and stopping just outside our cabin door. Another good old story from South Africa. As people from there might know, there are a lot of game farms, lodges, and those sites of facilities, especially around the area of Kruger National Park. This incident took place on a very tranquil 4-star game farm close to the southern tip of the aforementioned park. We frequented this lodge often over the 5 years before this incident. It was a favorite with me and my wife, actually, who was at the time still my girlfriend. The lodge had a very nice central area, with a pool, restaurant, and then tented chalets were spread around, with the furthest one about 1 kilometer from the restaurant. They were very private and set up in the bush as well, You couldn't see the next one over because of this, and could only really hear your neighbors if they were very loud. Sadly, the lodge had fallen on some hard times and gone backwards a bit. The weekend this incident took place, only 2 of the 25-plus units were occupied for that Friday night, and we were the only ones there on Saturday. Honestly, that made me feel a little bit uneasy. To make matters even worse, the lodge/farm manager came by on Saturday morning, saying he would be leaving for the weekend as well. He told us if we needed anything to just help ourselves to the restaurant fridges and leave a note. We could settle the bill at a later time. Sure, no problem, I guess. We had the pool and jacuzzi and the rest of the facilities all to ourselves. We left to go for a visit to the KMP after the manager left and stayed out most of the day. We got back around 3 p.m., and right as we got out of the car, I immediately got goosebumps. It was 35 degrees Celsius out, over 100 degrees in Fahrenheit, so I definitely was not getting those from being cold. We had parked about 150 meters away and had a little path we liked to walk down. As we approached, though, I noted some large shoe prints over me and my girlfriend's prints from that morning. That put me even more on edge. I approached further and noticed the prints turned around suddenly and walked back the way they had come. Everything seemed to be in order when we got there, though. We went for a bit of a swim and a bit of a game drive around the farm as well, and returned at around 5:30. I started to make the fire, barbecue the meat, and prepare some other food. Those footprints still had me and my girlfriend on edge, though, and we were both very quiet. We sat down at around 8 p.m. to have dinner together. As we sat down, though, I could tell my girlfriend looked very worried. I asked her what was wrong. She said she had a really bad feeling for some reason, and we had to go right now. I felt the same, honestly. We needed to leave now, not after we ate, right this moment. We checked the food in the cooler, grabbed everything we could, and ran to the car. We jumped in and raced out of there. As we went out the gate and started to drive away, the feeling of dread slowly left us as well. We made the 150-kilometer drive home in the dark and slept in our own beds that night. We woke up on Sunday and went about our day as normal. About 4 p.m. that afternoon, though, my phone number rings. I saw it was the number from the lodge manager. I answered, and he frantically asked if we were okay. I said, yeah, why? He started explaining what happened, and I got ice cold. Apparently, that very same night, the lodge was broken into and ransacked. They took everything of value, and what they couldn't take had been destroyed. It seemed it was a group of men that had done it. Apparently, there was evidence they had ransacked one of the abodes as well. Only one. The one my girlfriend and I had booked into. The one we would have been sleeping in, had we not left so abruptly the previous night. That means they had been watching us the whole time. The lodge had cameras, but the part we were staying in did not. We left just after 8 p.m., probably about 8:20 or so. Cameras caught the first signs of movement at the lodge just before 8:30. At least one was visibly armed with a firearm in the footage, and a few had machetes as well. I shudder to think what would have happened had we actually been there. The nearest people would have been over 3 kilometers away in a straight line, and we were completely alone out there. There wasn't any cell reception at the lodge either. We wouldn't have been able to call for help. Needless to say, we did not go to lodges or isolated areas for a long time after. And sadly, even though we loved that place, it went under not long after too. I saw some ads it was being sold on bank auction. That incident shocked us both a bit, and we vowed to always trust our instincts and intuition from then on. Also, to tell each other if something ever felt off to one of us. We both had had that uneasy feeling since about 3 that afternoon when we came back, but the reason neither of us said anything was because we didn't want to spoil the trip for the other. The cost was almost the ultimate price. Lesson to be learned here: trust your gut and tell your partner what you're feeling. If something feels off, it's probably because it is. It may just save your life. This story happened when I was a junior in high school. I'm a girl and was a friendly/curious person. 1 month into the fall semester, we got a new transfer student. He looked very nervous. Seated behind me, his name was Joe. I, of course, introduced myself to him, trying to ease some of his tension. I helped to teach him what we'd learned so far, and I helped him look over his class schedule as well. We had 2 classes and lunch period together. Naturally, because of all this interaction, we got to know each other and become somewhat good friends. He was a quiet kid on his own, but he talked quite a lot around me. I assume that just meant he was very comfortable with me. I made it very clear we were just friends, by the way, and he seemed not even interested in anything else. We started hanging out with my group of friends as well. Fast forward to spring break. I told Joe I was going out of town with my family. He seemed very disappointed we couldn't spend the break together, but he said it was understandable. A while later, though, I ran into Joe in a restaurant. I hadn't told him where I was going, so I thought to myself, wow, well, what a coincidence, right? He said he happened to be visiting family in the same town. Going along further in senior year, Joe and I were now hanging out at least once a week. Then that turned into 2, then that turned into 3. I started to notice we were spending a bit too much time together. I wanted to make time for my other friends too, you know? That's when things started to change. I would run into Joe everywhere, or should I say it was more like I'd see him out of the corner of my eye whenever I was spending time with someone else, or hiding behind something when I was by myself. It was obviously very obsessive and clingy. The first 2 or 3 times, I didn't really think that much of it. It all became clear, though, when I questioned him on why this was happening. He told me he was accidentally following me because he wanted to make sure I was safe. Well, now I felt really creeped out. He apologized and asked for forgiveness, but I told him I didn't want to be friends anymore. He got furious and stormed out. He didn't come to school for the next 2 or 3 days. My friends had told me he'd begun harassing them for snitching on him or something. I don't really know how that made sense. He did come back to school eventually, only to pretend he didn't know me. One particular day on my walk home, I began to hear Joe calling my name in a low and unfamiliar tone. When I looked around, though, he was nowhere to be seen. I didn't know why in that moment, but my gut told me I needed to run away as fast as I could. I started sprinting and kept running until I got home. I was too scared to look back. I made sure every door and window was locked up tight. Actually, I hadn't seen him the entire way. I almost convinced myself I was just being paranoid. When my phone screen lit up, Joe was calling me repeatedly. Then I heard him calling my name again. I went to check. He was in front of my house now. He began to bang on the door. I called my dad and told him what happened. I pleaded for Joe to just go away. Everything went completely silent after 5 minutes, which felt like an eternity. The last words I heard from him as he left were, "You'll always be my best friend." The issue was brought up to the school, but Joe never showed up again after. Now 4 years have passed by, and just a few days ago, I got friend requests on 2 of my social media accounts. It was Joe. I blocked him and changed my names to something else. I don't live in the same town, I don't live in the same country. Now I'm on the other side of the world. Still though, I can't help but feel scared like 18-year-old me again. I've become much more cautious around other people because of him. I did report him and get a restraining order against him when that happened. Warning, this story has some graphic details. So I'm just gonna get it out there because it's been heavy on my shoulders for about a month now. The night of National Day here in my country, after having a nice meal with some of my friends, my boyfriend asked me to go check on one of his friends. They had a father-son kind of relationship, and his friend was not feeling very well. He had some heart-related conditions, and my boyfriend was quite worried. On our way home, we decided to stop by his place real quick, around 10 at night. We got there, drank a beer, had a friendly chat with him, his wife, and his stepson for a moment. After about 45 minutes, we were just about to leave when we heard a crazed howling coming from outside in front of the house. In retrospect, it almost sounded like a zombie's growling. His stepson cautiously opened the door and asked what was going on. He didn't even have time to finish his sentence before a man erupted at the door. He was covered in blood. I mean dark black, dried blood. So much of it, I almost thought he was a different ethnicity because his skin had such a dark tone from all that blood. It took me about 30 seconds to realize that all that blood was coming from 2 gigantic, gaping wounds in the side of his head. I must say, he looked and sounded like a living corpse. There were 3 gashes. The biggest was on the middle from his forehead all the way down to the back of his head, 2 inches wide at the largest. The guy began to scream and yell and thrash around before falling to the ground and freezing just like in the movies. We jumped into action. This guy was clearly not in good shape. We brought him out without looking back. I can't really explain what went through my mind in that moment, but I knew that if we were not on our way to the hospital right now, this man would not survive. I sat him down on the front passenger seat and did my best to keep him awake while my boyfriend drove. We called 911 the minute we got onto the road so they could send an ambulance to meet us on the way there. The agent on the phone started asking me to pull the car onto the side of the highway and wait for the ambulance to get there, but we couldn't do that. The man was clearly going to die very soon. We kept on going as fast as possible. We arrived at the hospital before the ambulance and the police. As soon as we got there, medics rushed outside and came to help him right away. The police then arrived too, and took our disposition. Guess what happened next, though? The man had been so badly hurt that he fell into a coma only 30 minutes after arriving, before the police could interrogate him as to what happened. From that moment on, police started procedures for a homicide investigation, and we were considered the prime suspects. They finally let us go home at 4 a.m. They came back the next day asking further questions and letting us know that now they knew we were not related to this crime. They informed us the man had also escaped the hospital the next morning. The attack was probably gang-related, and those gashes had been done by a machete. He'd managed to survive the attack because he was completely strung out on heroin. I'll never forget that night, and that man's horrifying screams. At least I can hold on to the fact that I helped to save a life. I've been wanting to share this for a while, so here goes. In 2007, when I was 12 years old, my family and I took a trip to Key Biscayne, Florida, with some of my cousins and family friends. Naturally, while at the resort, my cousins and I would all hang out at the kids' club. Well, there were always a bunch of kids to hang out with, epic chicken fingers with ranch dressing, and tons of fun games for us all to play. There was a director of the kids' club who watched us and facilitated all of the activities. His name was Dan. In retrospect, I'm sure you can imagine Dan was a major fucking creep. He was around 40 years old, super tall, skinny, and was balding quite badly. The worst part is that he always made us call him Dan the Animal Man. Side note, these sorts of memories leave me in awe of how naive and blinded to danger I was. I'm sure most of us were as a kid, really. If I ever met this guy now, I wouldn't want to get within a 5-foot radius of him. At 12 years old, though, I was thinking he was awesome. Time is a wonderful thing, I suppose. Anyway, I digress. It was made clear to all of us suddenly that Dan, for unknown reasons, was leaving the hotel in a week. None of this fazed me, though. On our last day there, I just so happened to lose my cell phone. It was a bright blue chocolate cell phone, if anyone remembers those gems with the spinning wheel. I quickly told my parents I couldn't find it. Considering this was already the second phone I'd lost that year, my mom yelled at me and told me if I didn't find it, I'd be grounded for a long time. I rushed around the entire hotel, looking everywhere for my phone. Along the way, I just so happened to go into the kids' club to see if anyone there had found it. The room that was typically bustling with kids and activity was now eerily quiet and empty. Dan was just sitting on a couch all by himself. "Hey, Dan, did you by chance see my phone?" I asked him. He responded right away. "Oh, yeah. Actually, I found it and put it in the lost and found in the basement. Come with me, I'll show you." Thinking nothing of this, I mindlessly followed behind Dan as he led me all the way to the back of the hotel. We had walked for around 3 minutes before we arrived at the foot of an abandoned stairwell leading into a dark basement. We were now at the very back of the hotel in a strange area I'd never seen before, and no one else was in sight. "Are you sure it's down here?" I asked, very confused. I was staring down a long flight of stairs leading into pitch black darkness. The walls were made of unpainted concrete. It didn't even look like it could be a storage area, let alone a basement with a lost and found. Dan nodded happily and held the door open for me, motioning for me to head down myself. Something in that moment suddenly woke up. I'm not sure if it was instinct, fear, or just luck, but I immediately knew I could not go down there. Before Dan could say or do anything, I blurted out, "Never mind, I think I left it with my mom." I darted as fast as I could back to the hotel lobby. I was shaken up. Something about that situation was not right. I just knew he was going to hurt me. As a kid who wore rose-colored glasses and was overly trusting of others, that really shook me. I tried to compose myself and figured I'd investigate a bit more just to be sure. I walked up to the concierge of the hotel and asked them where the lost and found was because I'd lost my phone recently. The woman at the front desk was very nice and told me the lost and found was just right there, right next to her. She then asked me what kind of phone I'd lost. After I told her it was a blue chocolate flip phone, she smiled and pulled it right out of the box under her desk. "Don't worry, someone turned it in here earlier," she said and handed me my phone with a big smile. "Wait, so you're telling me the lost and found isn't in the basement?" I stammered. "No, sweetie, the hotel is still under construction. The basement is being rebuilt. There's not even any electricity down there or anything." That scared the absolute shit out of me. I couldn't shake the feeling that man was dangerous. At the time, I was sharing a hotel room with my cousin, and she was the only person I told. Considering she was only 8 at the time, I think all I did was really freak her out. Now I'm 26 though, and I think back on that moment a lot. I wonder what would have happened to me if I'd gone down to the basement with Dan the Animal Man. It truly feels like one of the most critical junctures of my entire life. I'm happy I knew to get the hell out of there before it was too late. I recently contacted that hotel to inquire about past Kid Club employees named Dan from 2007, just to see if he's still around somewhere, or on a sex offenders list, maybe even in jail. I told them this whole story, but they refused to give me any information about him and sounded pretty sketchy about it, honestly. I'll continue to do some research, and if I ever find more information, I suppose I'll tell you guys as well. Recently, I was shopping in a very popular department store when I had the feeling I needed to use the bathroom. The women's restroom was all the way in the very back of the store, right near an emergency exit. This meant it was pretty secluded. I walked in the 2-stall bathroom. One of them was already taken. Without thinking anything of it, I went into the only other stall available. As soon as I locked the door, though, the person in the other stall, without even flushing, unlocked their door and walked over to the sink. I was not really thinking too much of it in that moment. I'm kind of shy, so I was just sitting there waiting for them to leave. Instead, they did nothing. Now I was kind of confused. I pieced together they were not washing their hands, and they'd never flushed the toilet either. I slowly tilted my head down as quietly as possible to look underneath the stall. I noticed that whoever this was very clearly wearing large men's boots and ratty jeans. Now I was really scared. I'm a natural worrier already, and we were in a very secluded area. I tried to calm myself down and count to 15 to give them a chance to prove me wrong. Maybe it was just a girl fixing her makeup or something. As I was counting, though, I realized that even if it was a woman fixing her hair or something like that, I would surely have heard some sort of shuffling or any noise at all. Instead, it was complete silence. I counted all the way to 15 and still no movement. Now I was fully shaking. I realized just how alone we were. I was cornered in a bathroom with what I assumed was a large man based on their legs. I reached into my purse to fake a phone call. I was so nervous I didn't even think to try to make my phone ring by playing a ringtone first. I just put it to my ear and said, "Hello?" I was too nervous to even keep making up conversation because I didn't know what the man would do. Luckily, as soon as I did this, he left immediately. I watched his feet under the stall to make sure he was gone. Even creepier, I watched him walk to the right. As I exited the bathroom as fast as I could, I noticed that to the right of this restroom was the emergency exit door, now propped open. Who knows what this guy wanted to do, or where he wanted to bring me. There could have been a car right out back waiting for us for all I know. I still can't imagine the face I would have seen looking back at me if I'd just finished my business and left the stall. I told the store manager after, and I kinda feigned concern, but I could tell they either didn't really care or didn't believe me. I even called their headquarters the next day to report it again. This happened 3 years ago, while a former relationship of mine was ending. I was 27 years old at the time. My ex-boyfriend and I weren't living together anymore. We were separated for a few months, but not quite broken up yet. I had just found out from his twin brother that he was keeping me as a backup while having fun with other girls. I decided to end things because of this. It was my birthday, and I was a bit emotional about this whole situation, so I decided to go to his place and end it properly face to face. I took an Uber driver there and went to the other side of town. It was very far away from where I lived, and in a not-so-safe-for-girls area. I got there, and we talked, ended things on good terms given the situation, and now it was time to call an Uber to go back home. It was November on a rainy night, and we had talked for so long it was about 2 a.m. now. My ride came and I hopped in. I was looking out the window and thinking upon what had just happened. After 5 minutes or so, though, I noticed my Uber driver was staring at me in the rear-view mirror every second he could, whenever he could take his eyes off the road. I brushed this off at first. This wasn't the first time this had happened, and honestly, I was too sad to care. But I started to notice that he was slowing down a lot. This is when I started to pay attention to my surroundings as well. I noticed that he was tall and very thin. He looked like he didn't take very good care of himself, and his car was actually pretty filthy. Out of nowhere, he started talking to me. "You are so beautiful." Thanks? What's your name?" I whispered my name after a long pause. Wow, that's so sexy. I always wanted to have sex with a girl named my name. He continued to stare at me and started rambling without pause, clearly expecting reactions from me. "Do you have a boyfriend?" "Yes." "What a shame. I wanted you for myself. But I don't mind, you know. Let's go somewhere else. Come on, change the address in the app, 'cause I can't. Only you can. I know a place where we can go be alone and do some fun stuff." At this point, I started to pay closer attention to the route he was taking. I was almost ready to jump out of the car. The situation was getting pretty sketchy. "Are you going home alone? I could call it a night and go to your place, show you the kind of things I'm talking about." My heart was racing at this point. I actually did live alone. I decided to start recording him from here on, and couldn't think of anything else but to send the recording to my ex. "No, my parents are waiting for me." "Aw man, what the fuck? We can stay in the car though, I guess. Find a spot where it's dark." "No, I need to go home, I'm tired." "Come on, trust me. Where did I put that weed?" He started searching for something. My ex listened to this part and called me. I was so relieved when I saw my phone ringing. I answered and made sure the driver would hear I was on the phone with someone. He seemed to be very upset about my unexpected phone call, and now he had started talking to himself. My ex was furious, of course, but told me to say things out loud like where I was, when I would get home, other stuff like my mom was waiting for me. I ended the phone call and the driver asked me if that was my boyfriend. I said that it was, and he was silent for about 5 minutes. When he saw on the map that we were getting close to my address, he started asking me again to go somewhere or stay in the car with him. His speech was getting scarier, and he was getting more and more anxious that he couldn't convince me. He was turning around to fully look at me whenever the lights stopped. After what seemed like forever, we got in front of my building. I leapt out of the car and ran away. He called out that he wanted to come with me, but I entered the building and shut it behind me. I didn't turn on the light in the staircase because I didn't want him to see the block I lived in. I stood there in the darkness and peeked out the window just to see if he was gone, but he wasn't. I could see he was clearly observing the entire property, waiting to see exactly which light would turn on, aka where I lived. I couldn't even enter my apartment because I had left the lights on in my hallway and he would see that light shining through. I waited about 30 minutes before he finally left. I quickly entered my apartment and locked everything, but I didn't turn on or off any lights so it wouldn't seem like it was my home. I peeked out my window just to make sure he'd indeed left, but to my surprise he had suddenly reappeared, parked this time right next to the apartments. I was scared. I was scared out of my mind. I know that many would say I should have called the police at this point, but in my country, the police don't come for stuff like this. They barely show up in an hour if someone's getting beaten to death. He was just sitting there. Then I got a message from an unknown number telling me to come back down because he was waiting for me. I froze and cried. It was like my life was about to completely change just because of a 30 to 40 minute ride with an unstable person. I didn't even know how he'd gotten my number. From the Uber app? Did he buzz me when he arrived to pick me up? I couldn't even remember anymore. I didn't reply. He kept on sending me more messages. I remember one in particular that really creeped me out. He was asking me to at least come down and smoke with him, and I could hear his raspy breaths in smoking. He started calling me as well at some point, and eventually I blocked the number. I was afraid he would get angry and try to sneak into the building to find me. I was looking out the window from behind a curtain. I saw that after I blocked him, he kept on trying to call but couldn't. He started to smash his phone against the steering wheel, and finally, after 40 minutes, he left. I remained keeping watch for another 2 hours or so. Thankfully, he did not return another time. The next day, though, he did message and call from another number, but I blocked that one as well. He kept on trying for an entire year. I was extremely surprised he was so vigilant about it. I blocked all those numbers, and eventually I never heard from him again. I also never saw him in person or his car either. I reported everything to the Uber app, and I hope they took some measures. Honestly, I don't understand why nobody before me reported him. Unfortunately, living in London, I've been attacked a few times, but this was by far the scariest, and also the first. I was 8 years old at the time, visiting my grandparents who lived in London. At the time, I didn't live there yet, and I was just visiting for the summer. I was on a day outing with my parents and our visiting American friend. Let's call her Laura. My dad grew up in this area, so he wanted to take us sightseeing. We had done the Tower of London, Trafalgar Square. We were wandering through the Oxford Street area, just window shopping. I remember I was trailing slightly behind my parents for just a moment, looking into a busy cafe as I walked. It had a counter bar where 2 large ladies were perched on pedestals eating some ice cream. All of a sudden, I remember watching these two ladies fall to the side off their chairs onto the floor, almost as if in slow motion. It was like a dream sequence. I even recall the music from the cafe sounding like it was underwater and slowed down momentarily, except they weren't falling to the floor. Actually, it was me. All I remember next is a huge shooting pain coming from my back and Laura screaming over me. I watched my mom sprinting away through the busy forming crowd full of shocked faces, staring down at me with concern. My dad was on his phone. I remember being angry somewhat because mobile phones were new at the time, and he was always on his, talking to work stuff. I later found out that actually he was calling the police. It took me a moment to figure out what actually happened to me. Well, I thought those big ladies were falling off their chairs. Actually, a homeless man in a heavy coat had suddenly come out of the crowd, picked me up by my collar, and slammed my head down into the pavement. My mom had immediately run after him, chasing him down a busy London street until he pulled a knife on her. Somehow, she and 3 men who were following managed to disarm the man and hold him down until the police arrived. It took around 2 minutes. In the moment it happened, I had no recollection of being attacked. I was excited to ride in an ambulance actually and a police car, and to get the experience of going down to the station. I asked to see a cell, and even remember getting a pen by a police officer. I was in a lot of pain, but I couldn't understand why the paramedic was fussing over me so much. Boy, when the adrenaline wore off, it sure did hurt quite a lot. It's amazing how a child's mind works when it's trying to protect you. As a side note, I did wake up screaming for months every night after, saying the man had snuck into my room. According to my mom at least. I only remember that happening once. In fact, I had a cracked rib, giant black bruises all over my chest, and bruises all over my back from the viciousness of the attack. Later in life, I remember his face quite clearly. It's almost amazing that I didn't remember in the moment just how high he'd picked me up to slam me down. The memory was triggered by receiving birthday bumps as a teen, and it all came rushing back in the most bizarre way. I later found out that the man had in fact been using that large knife for a long time to murder other homeless people at night, and had attacked a few little girls in public as well. He'd always gotten away, though. The police had been looking for him for months. It just so happened the dude hadn't counted on my mom being so fearless. He was put away that very same day, and I had to go to therapy for a few years to figure out just what went on. When I was in college from the ages of 16 to 20, I came into contact with a tutor at my college. His name was Jonathan, and he taught biology at my school. At first, he treated me rather normally, but as time went by, I started to notice things about him that would unsettle me. It started when I'd be sitting in class working or whatever. I'd look up to see him just staring across the room at me from his desk. If I looked at him, he wouldn't look away right away. I'd look away first, then back, and he'd be looking at something else. It used to make me feel uncomfortable, so bad I would purposely go for help with assignments to other tutors. Another thing he would do was constantly mark my assignments and leave the message, "Come find me." He would always do this under the simplest mistakes, even a missing comma, rather than just writing what I needed to add to the assignment. This forced me into interacting with him. He'd always turn the topic of conversation into something else. When I mentioned it to my only friend, she told me he was just being friendly, but I always felt so intimidated by this friendliness. She began to joke I must have had the hots for him, so I stopped telling other people what was happening. When I used to sit on the grass near the campus lake, I would use that time to play my Nintendo Switch. One time when I was playing, I felt a presence at my back and snapped around, only to see him sitting at a picnic table alone staring at me. I felt unsettled by this too, of course. I got up to leave. He shouted at me and said we needed to talk about some assignment. I asked him how long he'd been sitting there. He told me he'd just gone outside to think moments ago and hadn't realized he was looking at me. He went on talking about how our assignment was worth extra marks or something. He told me he noticed I didn't seem to have many friends and asked if I had a girlfriend. I lied and said yes, then said I needed to leave. After that, it was very obvious to me that he was watching me, but I found him very creepy and didn't know who to tell. I made a Reddit post and people said I was probably making something out of nothing, blamed my anxiety and told me to get therapy. I tried to just dismiss it as me being paranoid. Whenever I was at college though, I would see him everywhere. I'd look over in the library only to see him watching me. Outside in the courtyard, I'd see him following me behind a building. It made college into a nightmare for 4 years straight, and I had nobody I felt like I could talk about it with. I remember one situation where he taught a lesson about how livestock animals are artificially inseminated. Without going into graphic detail, he started talking about milking them for their seed with a gloved hand. Nothing out of the ordinary for that type of class. We were given assignments like that as part of our course anyway. Jonathan, though, said he had marked my assignment for something and I had to wait for it at the end of the lesson. When everyone else had left the room, I went up to his desk to grab it. When he handed it over to me, I noticed he was wearing a single glove on one hand and gave me an eerie smile. I got creeped out and left. Didn't ask anything, just left the room. I was worried nobody would believe me about how weird he was being. When I graduated college, he sent my whole class friend requests on Facebook. I didn't accept, of course, but for a long time he continued to just delete and resend the request all the way up till I blocked him. At one point, I got a random text from an unknown number saying we needed to talk, and he had uncontrollable feelings for me. I knew who this was, of course, and blocked the number right away. He was so obsessed with me, he bought a house on the same street as me and bought a dog so he could walk it and run into me whenever I walked my own. He tried to make it look like an innocent coincidence, but I knew he'd been doing this just to get close to me. To avoid him, I started going on late-night walks at 2 a.m., thinking I would be safe because he'd be asleep, only for him to approach me in the street out of the darkness. I told him to leave me alone and called him a stalker. He apologized for the way he'd been acting and begged for a second chance. I'd never even given him a first one, though. I went home, and I became certain he might try to kill me. And that's when I told my parents, who contacted the police. They couldn't do anything about it, though, because I had no evidence of any of these situations taking place. It was at least on record now. My parents started paying towards rent, so I could live in a different area to feel safer. Well, wouldn't you know, as soon as I left to rent in a different city, he sold the house he'd bought and bought a new one in my exact same city. I then moved and started renting somewhere else, and he was stuck with this house he'd bought this time. Even to this day, I feel like I have to keep looking over my shoulder. I'm not a very tall guy. I'm only 5 feet. He's over 6.5 feet tall. He's very intimidating, and every time I see him, chills run down my spine. I'm too scared to even have an online dating account anymore. I'm planning to move country soon, so I can be rid of him once and for all. I won't say where I'm moving just in case he finds this. I doubt he would, but better safe than sorry. This happened 5 to 6 years ago. After meeting up with a couple of friends who were stationed near the bar, my friend Robin and I decided to end our girls' night early, at around 1 a.m. or so. I'm horrible with street names, so bear with me. We went to Rocket Bar that night, so you can know it was near there if you know that place. We hopped in a car and started pulling out. We were driving a bit slow because we weren't very familiar with the area, and we didn't want to get lost or miss any turns late at night. I had my window rolled down a bit, because when I drink, I can get a bit flushed. The street we were on was completely dead at this moment. We heard a yell out of nowhere, and some loud-ass crying as well. It was clearly a woman's voice, so we slowed the car down to try and see what was going on. Robin was driving, and I was in the passenger seat. On our right side, we saw a lady stumble out onto the street, holding her chest and sobbing. Robin locked the doors and cautiously rolled my window back up, leaving only an inch or so open. The lady stumbled right up to my window and said, "I need help." I asked her what was wrong. She just kept on repeating she needed us to help her over and over. Me, being a naive idiot, I put my hand on the door like I was about to open it, only to be grabbed firmly by Robin. She whispered in my ear, "Don't you dare fucking open that door." The woman kept on mumbling "I need help" repeatedly, like she was slurring her words together. As soon as she saw Robin stop me though, her eyes opened wide as hell, and she started screaming. We jumped up and said, "What's wrong? What do you need?" At this point, she shoved her fingers through the cracked part of the window and screamed to let her in. We started yelling at her to go away. The lady started yanking at my door handle. Robin said hell no, and we started to pull away. The next 30 seconds was the most terrifying part. All of a sudden, the lady called out into the night, "They're leaving!" We saw a bunch of people run out from a car parked a few cars behind us on the right. Robin sped away like a scene from an action movie. We looked into the rearview mirror and saw there were 4 people standing in the street now. Ladies and gentlemen, please be careful. I can't imagine what would have happened to my dumb ass if it weren't for my friend. I know it's in some of us to want to help, but there are a lot of evil people out there who disguise themselves to do us harm. Be aware of your surroundings and lock your doors in DC. When I was 15, I traveled with 2 friends who were both 15 as well. We took the train to get to an event a few hours away from where we lived. We were all interested in working in healthcare and went to a "what it's like to work in this field" event in another city. After the event ended, we didn't have long to get to the train station to catch our train home. We had pre-booked for a taxi from the venue straight to the station because of this. This was before the days of Uber, mind you. When the event ended in the evening, finishing slightly late, we rushed out to find our taxi, who must have been waiting for us. We approached one that appeared to be waiting for someone specifically. We had seen the driver turning away other people for a while. I called out to him, "Excuse me, is this the taxi for my name to the train station?" The taxi driver said yes. So we all quickly jumped into his car. After 10 minutes of driving though, my friend got a call from the taxi company saying our pre-booked taxi was back at the venue, still waiting for us. We realized this was not our taxi. I asked the driver to turn around, only for him to glare at me. No, I'm not going to do that. He locked the doors right there and then. We started protesting, telling him to stop, that he wasn't our driver. He had lied to us that it was our taxi. Of course, he refused. My friend panicked and started hyperventilating. We thought he was going to kill us. Maybe that was an overreaction, but we were young and far from home in a dangerous situation. He started screaming at us that he wasn't going to let us out. We were in his car now. Eventually, I threatened to call the police, at which point he braked sharply and told us to get out right now. He left us on the side of the road and sped off at 90 miles per hour. The road was completely deserted. It was a dark winter evening, and we were all pretty freaked out now. My friend called the booked taxi, and thankfully they picked us up and took us to the station anyway. We didn't manage to get the fake taxi's number plate or any information from the car. In retrospect, I don't know if he really meant us harm. Perhaps he just wanted to scalp the journey and get paid instead. But we were 3 young 15-year-old girls far from home. He really panicked us by behaving so aggressively and locking the doors. Now in my mid-20s, I always carefully check the number plate on the Uber app to make sure it's the right car. I'll preface this by saying this is a true story. We were staying in this fancy hotel for my cousin's wedding, and I was around 12 at this time. I woke up very suddenly that morning to a rough shove, assuming it was my sister waking me up. It was early morning, sometime around 7:30 or so. I groggily stepped out of the bed and was immediately hit with hairspray fumes. I could hear the sound of someone taking a shower, as well as loud hurried footsteps and repetitive spritzes of the hairspray can. I walked to the dresser and pulled out a blouse and a skirt. As I got dressed, I heard knocking on my door. I pulled my top fully on and opened it. No one was there. I was kind of freaked out right now, but I knew it must just be my imagination or something. After all, I was still half asleep. I exited the bedroom and heard the shower shut off as I passed by the lavatory. I then heard my father's heavy footsteps at the end of the hall. There was another restroom there. I could hear that same hairspray noise coming from inside, so I called out, "Hey, Mom, if you're in there, I need to pee. Dad's in the other bathroom right now." I heard my mother's voice call back, "Alrighty." It was definitely her voice, but that was not something she would ever reply with. I rolled my eyes though and walked away. I figured I should go wake my granddad, as I heard heavy snores coming from the room that he was sharing with my parents. In fact, I wondered why my parents hadn't woken him up yet. When I opened the door though, I was extremely startled to find that the room was empty. Just then, the noises and smell of hairspray stopped as well. I ran downstairs, only to see that everyone else was already eating breakfast. I checked my watch and saw it was already 10 o'clock. My mom stared at me. "What's wrong?" I started to ask. My sister interrupted me. "What the heck?" I asked them what was wrong. My sister then replied, "Didn't you just go to the bathroom?" She pointed to the lavatory next to the small kitchen area. I walked over there and pressed my ear to the door. Sure enough, I could hear someone was in there, washing their hands. I shook it off at first and counted my fingers. All 10 of them. It seemed I wasn't dreaming. I knocked on the door. Inside the bathroom, I heard a voice calling out, "Alrighty." I looked over at my parents, sister, and granddad, who were all pale. Behind my back, I heard the lock click, followed by what I swear was my own voice saying, "Hey there, Sarah," and footsteps. I turned around just in time to see my own feet, dressed in my black velvet flats, turning the corner on the staircase. At least, that's what it seemed. I felt paralyzed with fear, and goosebumps crept up my back immediately. I wasn't able to move for about a minute before I told my family about what happened a few moments ago. My sister told me that yesterday when she woke up, I wasn't in my bed, but she heard noises coming from the bathroom as well. When she went there, she saw someone that looked like me, walking down the hall in my pajamas. She called out to me, but they just kept walking. Well, when she went back to my room, she could see I was still sound asleep in my bed. She freaked out and didn't tell anyone. Fast forward to 2 years later, my cousin now has a 6-month-old baby, and we're talking to each other over tea. Well, I shared with my cousin that story about what happened to me and my sister, and she immediately froze. "What, you mean that happened to you too?" I felt goosebumps return to my arms and legs. She then told me she had woken up and walked downstairs, only to see someone who looked like her husband sitting at the table eating cereal. He greeted her like normal and then said he was going to get something from upstairs. Well, it was taking him quite some time. Eventually, she felt concerned and went to check on him, only to find he was still fast asleep in his pajamas. This is an incident that happened to my grandfather in the past. It was in the 1970s. Let's call my grandfather Dada. He was around 38 to 40 years old at the time this happened. They used to live in Patna, Bihar. Now, for your information, at that time, during the monsoon season, Patna used to get flooded a lot, and the danger of alligator attacks was also at its highest level. Every night he would go to the library, as he was very much into reading at that time. At the time of the monsoon, though, my Dada's elder brother used to accompany him to the library and back. After all, he didn't want to not go and find out his younger brother had died from an alligator attack or something. One day, they heard the rumor of a woman who practiced witchcraft roaming all around the city naked in the open air, killing humans for fun and dancing on their dead bodies. Apparently, she was a human being and nothing supernatural, but her mental condition was not exactly stable. The ignorant, superstitious people around thought she was a ghost. So, on to the encounter. One night, while returning from the library, he was crossing the mighty Ganga, which had alligators in it. There was no light, and both my dada and bro were obviously scared from this already. They had crossed the river. They didn't even realize it at the time when a dog arrived and his tail brushed against my dada's knee. In that moment, he thought it was an alligator, but then he looked down to see he was already on land, safe and fine. Instead, though, when he looked up, he saw something far more frightening. They moved ahead just a bit and looked back to see there was a woman naked in the open air, sitting on the land muttering something to herself, her eyes moving up and down rapidly, and there was now no sign of that dog. The woman turned to face them and smiled. "What's in the bag?" "None of your business." "There are books. I can see. I can see." She repeated this several times over. Then she got to her feet and frog jumped towards them. She jumped 3, 4, 5 times and then was right in front of them. She leaned in and whispered, "Can I kill you?" "What's wrong with you? Go back home!" She started to scream and cry aloud, screaming out home over and over. At this point, my daughter took a stone from the ground and threw it next to her to startle her. She suddenly fainted, and there they ran away as fast as possible. After a few minutes, though, just when they thought they'd arrived in a safe place, she was right in front of them again. She had that stone in her hand now, acting like she was ready to kill them. My grandfather tried to think quick. His brother used to smoke and always carried cigarettes on him. I don't know if any of you know about this, but here there's this thought of narcotics being so intoxicating it makes the person sleepy and gloomy. He asked his brother to take out that patch of cigarettes and lit one, holding it out towards the woman. She threw the stone away and grabbed the cigarette. Then she smoked it for a bit before slowly dozing off, or so it seemed. They started running again. This time they looked back and saw the woman was missing once more, and they couldn't see where she was at all. They ran and never stopped until they arrived back home. The woman was about terrorizing people for some time after. Unfortunately, some days later he heard the woman had been killed by a wild alligator. It seemed that even in death her body was smiling. An unfortunate series of occurrences to be sure. I still feel sick to my stomach whenever this memory pops back up. I was maybe 15 years old at the time, and my family had taken a trip to a ski resort in West Virginia. I'm the oldest out of 2 boys and a girl. The girl was maybe 6 at the time. She was adorable, big blue eyes and this crazy blonde hair. Bold and mature for her age because she'd grown up around all the big kids. My younger brother, who was maybe 8, and my aforementioned little sister decided to hang out in the sauna with me. We had been to the resort a few times before, and I was 15 years old. That seemed like a reasonable age to go off for an hour or so with just me and my siblings. Well, stupidly, while in the sauna, we wanted something from the hotel room, or I think wanted to tell our parents something maybe. This was before you brought a cell phone everywhere you went. In our idiocy, we decided to send my little sister to go do it. Thinking back, I really can't believe we decided to do that. But you know how immature kids think. You get the one who's the youngest to do the tedious stuff. Well, some time had passed by, and we heard my sister come pounding down the hallway in her pink bathing suit, sprinting, with an older man chasing behind her. I'll never forget how he looked. He lunged forward, walking as quickly as he could. His eyes bore into my little sister. There was a tight frown on his face, framed by his white mustache. My brother and I watched in absolute shock, trying to understand what was going on. The sauna had a glass door looking down the hallway, I rushed out and grabbed my sister, pulling her into the sauna and staring at the man with wide eyes, scared but doing my best to be defensive. The man instantly froze when he saw us and began slowing down. Then he walked by the sauna like nothing had ever happened. It was at the end of the hallway though, so there was nowhere else really to go. Because of this, he stopped for a moment, then looked to a door right on the other side of the sauna that led to the gym, and mimed an "oh," as if that was what he'd been looking for the entire time. Mind you, he was wearing a collared shirt and slacks. He actually looked like he was shaking a bit. Needless to say, I asked my sister what exactly had happened. She said shortly after leaving the hotel room, the man had come out of nowhere and started following her all over the place. She got really scared and began running. He started running after her. I told my mom what happened, and of course she was so pissed we'd sent a little girl out in a bathing suit through this big-ass hotel all by herself. I still get sick when I think about what could have happened. If he'd grabbed her before she made it to the sauna, I can still see his gross mustache in my mind, and get so angry when my mind replays his sheepish "oh," as if chasing a small girl down a hallway is a normal thing to do while looking for the gym. I felt guilty for a long time for sending her out, and guilty for not saying something to him or reporting him. I sometimes wonder if he had done this before or after. In those moments, I try to remind myself just how young I was. I'm just glad I was there with them. Had it been just her and my little brother, who knows what could have happened. I was about 15 when I got my first real job in West New York, New Jersey. My mom had sent me to live with my sister, who was 13 years older than me. She and I had recently gotten into a huge argument. So much so, in fact, that we hadn't spoken in well over a week. Because of our argument, I ended up taking the bus to work that week instead of letting her drive me there. This place always had a lot of people coming in and out. I mostly served coffee and pastries for the customers. I had just moved from New Jersey to Florida, and I've always been a relatively nice and polite person. Smile, be conversationally friendly. Well, apparently I left an impression on some man who hung around during the day to talk to me, and generally would just wait for me to get off. Again, I was 15, and this guy must have been well into his 40s. I kept on working, and as the hours passed, he would come and go, always checking in and asking if I was almost done. I remember specifically him asking a lot of questions about when I was getting off. Did I live close by? Who was picking me up? The man seemed friendly enough though, and I really didn't know better, so I kept on small talking throughout the day. I really didn't want to be rude to a customer and lose my first job. Well, I had a relatively short shift since I was so young. When my time to clock out came, I tried to leave without making a big deal about it. This guy was keeping a real close eye on me though, and started to follow me out of the establishment. He wanted to accompany me to my bus. He just wanted to make sure I'd get there okay, he said. The man grabbed me by the arm and told me to come with him. He basically stalked me the entire day, and now he saw his chance to make his move. At this point, I started to get pretty scared, since this was back before I had a cell phone, or even really before texting was invented. I didn't have a beeper either, so I had no way to call for help. I hadn't made it that far from my job yet. I was still in the parking lot. Like a bat out of hell though, my sister suddenly sped into the parking lot mad as hell. Needless to say, when she saw this guy tugging me in the opposite direction, she got even more mad. Of course she yelled at me and told me to get the fuck in the car. Then she proceeded to yell at and threaten the man who was very obviously trying to abduct me. He hauled ass away, and when she got me in the car, she started throwing out all kinds of expletives. What the fuck were you doing with him? Etc., etc. When I finally got the opportunity to tell her what actually happened, she gave me the tightest hug, and we both started crying together. To this day, this is the part we both couldn't really understand. She told me that she had been coming home from work that day when she had a sudden nagging sensation she had to pick me up from work right now. She didn't even know I was working that day, but she had the sensation that she just needed to come get me. I worked a good 20 to 30 minutes away from our home. She proceeded to ignore this persistence at first. She parked, got into the elevator, and as soon as the doors closed, something inside of her screamed, and all of the alarms went off. She came back to get me, got into her car mad as hell that she was listening to this suspicious feeling or intuition or whatever that was alarming her. She didn't even think I was out of the house, but sure enough, she got there just in time. She's never experienced something like that since or ever before. I really don't know what to make of all of that. All I know is that she saved me that day. The guy kept trying to hang around, so I quit that job shortly thereafter, and she never allowed me to ride the bus there again or leave work alone. I moved to South Korea for university when I turned 18 years old. I'm 21 now, so this happened over 2 years ago now. Whilst there's definitely been unwanted attention from some guys in the past, most of them get the message that I'm not interested eventually. This, however, was a little bit more unsettling. The university I go to has an institute for language, which is where all of my classes were at the time. It's pretty common knowledge that most foreigners in this part of Korea would know of or study at this institute. It was not abnormal for me to receive random Facebook friend requests from guys wanting to learn English or make foreign friends. Most of the time, I'd just ignore them, unless we had a few mutual friends or I'd met them in person before. I got a friend request from this guy named Nico. We had quite a handful of mutual friends, and he'd messaged me too, saying he was sorry for the randomness of the request. He was just trying to make as many foreign friends as he could. Because he had so many mutual friends, I thought, what the heck? I accepted and messaged him back saying it wasn't really a bother. From what I could tell by his Facebook photos, he was heavily pierced and tattooed, and stated he was Japanese. He had studied in Canada and could speak good English, and was also a foreigner studying at my university. After a few days, he messaged me again and I replied. It was a fairly casual conversation, and would often bring up maybe meeting for a coffee or a movie, which I declined. Suddenly though, he started getting more aggressive for no reason. Every time I'd make a comment, he'd find some way to turn it into an argument, which grew tiring super fast. I started to just ignore him. He'd often ask if I had a boyfriend, to which I'd reply no, and he'd bluntly say we should be together. It was at this point I decided I really didn't want anything more to do with him. I politely declined on the basis that I didn't know him, we'd never met in person, and we hadn't even known each other a full week. He didn't take my refusal very well. He began throwing insults at me based on my looks, and saying overly graphic things he'd do to me if he ever saw me. Evidently, I was being stupid not to take him up on the offer, because I'd never do better than him and he'd make me see that. It creeped me out beyond belief, needless to say, so I just blocked and deleted him on everything and tried to forget about it. I mentioned this to a friend of mine, and she immediately knew exactly who I was talking about. Apparently, I was not the first girl he'd added on Facebook and tried to bully into meeting him and being his girlfriend. After asking around with a few more of my friends who were listed as those mutual friends on Facebook, they all described pretty much the exact same situations involving this guy. One girl even told me she'd given him the benefit of the doubt and met up with him. It turned out he didn't even go to our university. He lived over an hour away and would travel there daily to watch and obsess over which girl he would find on Facebook next. He also told her he was born in America and had never even been to Japan, so who knows how much of what he said to anyone was actually true. I felt a bit freaked out by this, but I tried not to let it bother me. After all, I'd never actually seen him around, and I'd blocked him, so what more could happen? That was until about a week or two later. I received a message from him on Facebook from a different account saying how he'd seen me that day at school. This shook me up a lot, since I hadn't even considered that he might actually be watching me in person. I ignored the message and blocked that account too. A few days later, I got numerous messages, all from different accounts claiming to be Nico's friends. They were saying how he'd had his account hacked. Could I please unblock him so he could just explain everything and we could talk it over? I ignored all of these messages too. I just kept receiving more and more though, all of which I'm pretty sure were just Nico himself trying to reach out to get my attention. The more I ignored them, the more violent and aggressive the messages became. I could tell that most of the time when he said he'd seen me, he was lying. He'd say things like, "I saw you at the library today, you fucking slut. You're a fucking four-eyed slut who can't get laid," and other messages to that extent. I knew he was clutching at straws because I never used the school's library to study, and although I wear glasses, I never wear them in public. Because of this, I was fairly confident he was all bluster. I just kept blocking the accounts and tried not to let it bother me too much. I figured he'd get bored enough soon and let it go. That was until one day after classes had finished. I was browsing the small convenience store in the building to grab a drink on my way home. I opened up the fridge to get a bottle of water, and when I closed the door, he was standing right there beside me. He didn't say anything. He just stared daggers at me. I hadn't ever seen him in person before. I'd never agreed to meet him, but I knew straight away this was him. Obviously, I freaked out. I dropped the bottle in place and sprinted out of the store. I didn't walk straight home because I was afraid he'd follow me and find out where I lived. Instead, I went back into school and stayed around areas where there were lots of people until a friend of mine came to meet me. After that, I'd see him all the time when I'd leave class. He'd just be standing there, doing nothing in particular, watching people as they walked past. Then he'd stare at me intently. I made sure to always be with friends when I went to and from class from then on, and didn't go anywhere alone for a while. After a week or so, though, the messages suddenly stopped, and I didn't ever see him again. The last time I heard from him was about a year ago, when he messaged me on yet a new Facebook account, asking if we could be friends again because he'd changed, and it was all just a joke. Needless to say, I ignored that message, blocked that account too, and will not be taking up his offer on being friends. I was mindlessly browsing Facebook one day when I received a message to my inbox. Clicking on it, I realized it was from someone who I didn't know. His name was Peter, and he sent me this. "Hi, I was taken aback by how beautiful you are in your picture. I hope you don't find that too forward. I saw you post on insert local company's name here, Wall. I thought your comment was pretty funny. I couldn't resist clicking on your profile and messaging you. Your sense of humor is just like mine, and I'd like to thank you for making me laugh today. I just lost my mother a few months ago, you see, and I've had a real hard time with it. I can't remember the last time I smiled, let alone laughed, so really, thank you." Now, normally I would not reply to messages from people I don't know, but I felt really bad for this guy. I thanked him and told him I was sorry for his loss, and I was glad I could help him laugh. Once he sent me a friend request, I had to let him know, though, I didn't have any intentions of adding him. I only used Facebook for people I know. The guy said he understood, and we said our goodbyes. I thought that would be it. One day, about a week after getting his initial message, though, I was out shopping at the local grocery store nearby my home when I noticed a guy looking at me from a few feet away down the aisle I was in. I looked over and smiled nervously. I'm somewhat shy and socially awkward. He smiled back and waved, then looked at what was in front of him. He looked familiar, but I couldn't quite put my finger on from where. I checked out with my groceries and went home. After putting everything away, I sat down and logged onto Facebook, only to see I had a new message from him. "I like the dress you wore today. It fit your body nicely. Thanks for smiling at me. It made me feel real special." I didn't realize that was him at the store, but seeing his picture again on Facebook definitely matched that guy. I was sort of sketched out by this, but of course, it could have just been a coincidence. We did live in the same area after all. I chose not to engage though, just to be safe. About another week goes by and I hadn't heard anything else from him. I was out with some friends at night at a park, just hanging out on the swings like we do when we were teenagers, when I noticed someone off in the distance. They were walking toward the park. My friends and I got spooked and went quiet immediately. I realized when the person was a bit closer that it was Peter. I spoke to my friends in a quiet voice. "Don't panic. Act natural, but we need to leave now. Get in the car." They didn't argue. We got in the car together and drove away. Peter was now gone though. I told my friends who that was and what had been going on. They told me I was just being paranoid. When I got home though, I realized I had another message on Facebook again, once more from him. "So, do you go to that park often?" I noped the fuck out and replied, "Do not ever message me again. My boyfriend is aware of the situation and he's a police officer, so leave me alone." I blocked him. Even though I made up the boyfriend thing to scare him, I guess it must have worked. I haven't heard from him or seen him again in months. I live with 3 people who all know what he looks like and know about the situation as well. They've been keeping a lookout and nothing suspicious has happened so far. That doesn't mean that I don't look over my shoulder every now and then though.